At the dawn of the 20th century, over a century ago, but still within living memory, the world appeared vastly different, almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. The powerful nations of Europe enjoyed their final years of peace, having experienced nearly a century without a major European war. America was an emerging global power, yet remained inward-looking, expanding across a continent separated by vast oceans. Much of the world was either under European rule or only partially independent, impoverished, undeveloped, and controlled by industrialized nations. People were not bound to one place, undertaking long steamship voyages that lasted weeks or months. Europe was sending its surplus population to its overseas territories. Britain was reshaping itself in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. Europe's struggling masses journeyed westward in pursuit of the American dream. Asian migrants were crossing the Pacific and reaching Africa. Throughout these developing nations, forged from untamed land, railways stretched like steel veins. Trains carried settlers deep into newly opened territories, as well as armies that brutally crushed any native resistance. Railways transported goods and raw materials to coastal ports for export worldwide. In this era, once migrants completed their long journeys, they settled permanently. Whether on a prairie homestead, an Australian farm, or in a New York tenement, many would never again travel more than a few miles from home. The concept of a holiday or vacation, a late 19th century invention, was limited to short train trips, if taken at all. In 1903, a new chapter in history began, one that would soon overturn this way of life forever. That year, Americans Wilbur and Orville Wright took flight, transforming rail into the long-held dream of human flight. Yet, while people had long imagined soaring through the skies, none foresaw the Concorde or the Boeing 747. Few could have conceived that within just 60 years of the Wrights' first short flight, millions of ordinary people would travel thousands of miles, some faster than a speeding bullet, often for little more than the price of a meal. A new frontier emerged. Aircraft quickly flew faster, higher, and farther. Nearly every week, a new record was shattered. Generous cash prizes were awarded to air race victors or the first aviator to complete a specific flight. The Wright brothers were just two among many engineers worldwide striving to build flying machines. While they had solved the intricate challenge of designing a propeller, they had not answered all the mysteries of flight. Different engineers contributed unique ideas that had to be combined to create a reliable and successful aircraft. France initially led the way in aviation technology. Louis Blériot, a French engineer and the first person to fly across the English Channel, developed powerful engines for swift, nimble monoplanes instead of bulky biplanes. Other French engineers realized that mounting the engine at the front to pull the plane forward was more efficient than the Wrights' approach, which placed both the engine and propeller behind the pilot. Many early aviators perished in crashes, often crushed by their own engines sliding forward upon impact. The Wright had controlled their aircraft by warping the wings. The method was impractical for larger aircraft or planes constructed from sturdier materials than thin wood and canvas. American engineer Glenn Curtiss introduced wing flaps, a crucial innovation still in use today. Despite the excitement of early races, records, and flight demonstrations, they did not establish the viability of a profitable airline industry for passengers or cargo. Before 1914, the only commercial flights carrying paying passengers were operated by German Zeppelin airships. These airships were massive balloons, huge envelopes of lighter-than-air gas held within a rigid metal frame. Majestic and steerable, They were equipped with engines and rudders, allowing them to transport heavy loads. By 1914, Zeppelins had already flown 37,000 passengers, primarily on sightseeing excursions. However, air travel could not have advanced without the push of war. By 1914, Britain's armed forces possessed just over 100 aircraft. By 1918, that number had surged to 20,000. The war years saw aircraft evolve to fly at speeds, distances, and payload capacities that had been unimaginable in the final year of peacetime. Such progress led to a milestone in 1919 when two British airmen, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown, became the first to fly non-stop across the Atlantic. They completed the journey to claim a 10,000-pound prize for the first successful crossing. An American pilot had previously flown the Atlantic, but only by island hopping in multiple stages. The aircraft used by Alcock and Brown was a British long-range bomber originally designed to strike Berlin. After the Great War, a surplus of ex-military planes and trained pilots made flying inexpensive. Flights were rarely taken for travel. They were a form of entertainment. Flying circuses. Barnstormers roamed across America and Europe, offering short flights for just a few dollars or pounds. Pilots thrilled crowds with aerobatic displays and death-defying stunts. Airplanes were cheap, and so was human life. In an era of economic hardship, desperate pilots took extreme risks to earn money. They walked on wings, performed dangerous low-altitude maneuvers, and, at the most extreme, deliberately crashed old, expendable aircraft.
Boy, you're hurt! None of that. Oh boy, that's a good one.
At the same time, some former military pilots were trying their luck with the first commercial air services, which would eventually grow into many of the world's major airlines. These early operations relied on converted bombers. In reality, making a profit from passenger flights was nearly impossible. No repurposed military aircraft was large enough to carry a financially viable number of passengers. A former bomber flying from London to Paris charged £42 per seat, more than half the average British annual income. Such journeys were taken more for adventure and prestige than for speed or convenience. 1927 marked one of aviation's most pivotal moments. American pilot Charles Lindbergh flew solo and non-stop from New York to Paris. Lindbergh's legend is so great that many mistakenly believe he was the first to cross the Atlantic. He was not. Nearly 80 people had crossed before him, and not all were daring pilots. Many had traveled in comfort aboard airships. Lindbergh made the journey to win a $25,000 prize. It was an incredibly dangerous flight. Just 2 weeks earlier, two of France's most celebrated aviators had vanished attempting the same crossing. Navigation was treacherous. Lindbergh could have easily become lost and disappeared like others before him. He fought overwhelming fatigue, pushing his aircraft, his endurance, and his luck to the brink of disaster. Lindbergh had an undeniable star quality: handsome, disciplined, and clean living. He did not smoke, drink, or dance, standing apart from the decadence of the Jazz Age. He possessed charm and a quiet confidence, often described as the ideal son any American mother would wish for. Lindbergh's charisma helped America embrace aviation. He reassured ordinary Americans that flying was safe, beneficial, and the future of travel. Touring the world as aviation's champion, he was said to inspire towns to build airports wherever he visited. Airlines hired him to scout new routes and test new aircraft. Every flight he took became a media spectacle. Star aviators played a crucial role in promoting air travel during the 1930s. British pilot Amy Johnson became a national heroine after her 1930 solo flight from London to Australia. For Britain, it was a powerful symbol, physically linking the motherland to one of its distant outposts, promising to unite families separated by vast distances.
I bring messages from the people of England to the people of Australia, and I should be very, very happy if this flight of mine can bring together people so far apart, but bring them together in fellowship and friendship and everything except mileage. If you could get airplanes bringing you together, that would be so much better, and get people coming out every week or so as I have done.
American aviator Amelia Earhart was another key figure in the push to popularize flight. Some historians argue that, unlike Lindbergh and Johnson, Earhart lacked what would later be called the right stuff, and was not the fearless pilot the media portrayed her to be. Even then, celebrities had publicists, and Earhart was carefully marketed as the female Lindbergh. Her rise to fame came in 1928, when she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, a flight from America to France that some have labeled a mere publicity stunt. The truth was that Earhart was more of a passenger than a pilot, at best serving as a co-pilot for the easier parts of the flight.
To fly the Pacific and the first person to fly it solo. Roses to Amelia and the plaudits of the world to a veteran of flights that have shown the way for aviation's progress. It's her most brilliant chapter in a 16-year aviation career. How does it feel to fly both oceans, Miss Earhart?
Well, it was very interesting to me to fly in southern waters rather than in the north. On the Atlantic flight, I had ice conditions and general storm. On this flight, really no bad weather at all except a few little rain squalls. I saw the moon and stars most of the night. Of course, in both flights, I was very glad to see land.
Many aviation stories dominating early 1930s newsreels revolved around airmail services. Airmail played a crucial role in the early expansion of commercial aviation. Before fax machines and the internet, letters were a valuable cargo, with customers willing to pay extra for faster delivery. Airmail was vital both to the vast European empires and to America, a nation stretching across a continent. Governments passed legislation to promote airmail, offering lucrative contracts that effectively subsidized emerging airlines. The power to award these contracts was often used to encourage, if not outright enforce, mergers, strengthening and streamlining the airline industry. Imperial Airways, a predecessor of British Airways, was formed in this way. In the United States, airlines like TWA, United, Eastern, and American Airlines emerged from government-facilitated mergers. In Australia's vast territories, the regional airline Qantas rose to national prominence as the government's preferred mail carrier. By 1929, KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, operated an 8-day route, the world's longest at the time, connecting the Netherlands to its colony in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. Mail contracts also drove innovation, including the development of towed gliders to increase airmail planes' carrying capacity. Airlines found that governments were setting conditions. To secure a mail contract, aircraft had to accommodate passengers as well as letters. They also had to fly at night, pushing airlines to develop new navigation technologies for darkness. The strength of America's growing airlines fueled rapid innovation among aircraft manufacturers. Many airlines formed exclusive partnerships with specific companies, United Airlines with Boeing and TWA with Douglas. A largely forgotten chapter of aviation history is the Ford Motor Company's early role in aircraft manufacturing. Henry Ford aimed to apply the principles of mass production, which had made automobiles affordable, to aircraft construction. Many airlines adopted the Ford Tri-Motor. The aircraft was practical but unattractive. Its boxy design created drag, slowing it down. Yet it was reliable, durable, and safe, and they were affordable. Ultimately, Henry Ford realized that the aircraft and automobile markets were never going to be comparable in scale. Ford aircraft was phased out, becoming a part of aviation history. In the 1930s, airliners faced competition from a more luxurious alternative, the airship. At a time when airliners couldn't carry enough fuel to fly across oceans, airships were capable of making those long journeys. Germany's Zeppelin Company led the world in airship technology. Their airships had terrorized the British during World War I, though in reality they were ineffective weapons. Throughout the 1920s, many countries tried to build airships, but most efforts ended in disaster and tragedy. Britain's airship program, intended to transport mail and important passengers around the empire, ended in the catastrophic crash of R-101 in October 1930. R-101's maiden flight was supposed to take it to India, carrying senior British officials, including the British Secretary of State for Air, Lord Thomson. Thomson had insisted that the flight proceed, despite safety concerns about the R-101. He had publicly declared that R-101 was as safe as houses. Tragically, Thomson perished just hours into the flight when R-101 crashed in northern France during a storm. The British airship had simply been uncontrollable in bad weather. Britain abandoned its airship program.
Now, Mr. Bell, you are one of the 6 survivors from the ill-fated R-101 disaster. How many people were actually killed?
48.
How did the crash happen?
Well, I think the weather was against us. We were a bit heavy and we just nosedived and hit the ground.
What do you remember most about the crash?
The fire.
How did you survive? How is you weren't killed?
Well, I was in the after engine gondola, and that was slung below the ship, you see, about 20 feet. And after we hit the ground, a water tank burst overhead, and so I stood in water while the flames passed around me.
I see. The fact you were wet, you didn't get burnt.
Well, I got burnt a little, but not too much.
Was there a lot of confusion and so on afterwards?
No, there wasn't many people there to cause any confusion. There was only 6 of us got out.
Mr. Binks, you're another survivor from the R-101. What do you most remember of that disaster? What sticks in your mind most?
Well, I was aroused at 2 o'clock in the morning to take over my watch in an engine car.
From Mr. Bell?
From Mr. Bell, yes. And, of course, got down into the car, which was slung under the centre line of the ship right aft. And in a very short time, of course, the ship took a sudden dive. I had no idea where we were, of course. Took a sudden dive, and she was pulled out of it again, got nice and trim again, and she's, in a short time after, she dived again, which, of course, was the last of her diving. She struck the ground and on a hillside in Beauvais, northern France, and took fire.
Have you any idea what caused the sudden diving?
No, I think it was really due to weather conditions more than anything. Heavy weather, rain on the ship, and approaching this hillside, it got the wind on the top of over the bows of the ship and forced her down.
Do you think this indicates that she was really an unsafe airship?
No, I don't. She wasn't unsafe. I hadn't gone anywhere in there.
France also gave up on airships after a similar disaster in 1923. Italy followed suit after an Italian airship crashed during an Arctic flight. America, which had focused on military airships, also endured a series of tragic accidents throughout the 1930s. The primary danger of airships lay in the gas used to lift them, hydrogen, the lightest element. highly flammable, hydrogen could ignite from even the smallest spark, turning a minor incident into a catastrophic disaster. In truth, airship design was just as complex and difficult as airplane construction, and only Germany had the expertise to make airships function properly. The Graf Zeppelin, one of the largest flying machines ever built, was 4 times the size of a modern Boeing 747. Launched in September 1928, it became a symbol of German national pride, funded by a public share offering that was eagerly embraced by ordinary Germans. The Graf Zeppelin was designed to cross the Atlantic, offering 20 passengers extreme comfort in its warm, quiet, spacious cabins, vastly superior to the noisy, cold passenger airplanes of the era. Even so, the high cost of a ticket on the Graf Zeppelin meant it could not attract enough passengers to be profitable. There was not enough demand for luxury travel between Germany and America to justify the cost that the Graf Zeppelin charged. While the Graf Zeppelin did succeed as a luxury cruise ship, offering sightseeing trips and voyages to Brazil, where a German expatriate community ensured sufficient demand, it was not financially sustainable on the transatlantic route. Germany pressed on, building a new, even larger airship designed to make the transatlantic route profitable. This was the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was a marvel of engineering, powered by new, efficient diesel engines, and intended to be lifted by a safer gas, helium. Helium was almost as light as hydrogen, but non-flammable, making it a much safer alternative. However, helium was regarded as a strategic resource in the 1930s, as sensitive and closely guarded as nuclear materials would be in the 21st century. The United States held a monopoly on helium production and refused to supply it to Germany, so the Hindenburg had to rely on hydrogen. After 10 successful trips, the Hindenburg tragically exploded in flames while attempting to land in New York. Static electricity in the air caused sparks, which ignited the hydrogen and led to the catastrophic explosion. Newsreel cameras happened to be in the right place at the right time, capturing the horrifying disaster for the world to witness. It was miraculous that there were any survivors. The Hindenburg disaster was one airship tragedy too many, and destroyed any remaining confidence in airships as a viable mode of travel. Of the 161 airships built, 60 met a similar fate to that of the Hindenburg. The airship was never going to be the foundation for the mass air travel that we enjoy today, as it could never match the speed of modern airplanes. A what-if of history suggests that, had the Hindenburg disaster not occurred, giant helium-lifted airships might have found a niche market as aerial cruise liners. With the end of the airship era, another romantic form of aviation emerged to provide a way to cross the oceans by air: the flying boat. The 1930s had been described as the short but glorious golden age of the flying boat. While flying boats couldn't land just anywhere or in any water conditions, they were still seen as a safe way to cross vast expanses of ocean. Their large boat hulls offered ample space, making them luxurious compared to the land-based airliners of the time. Flying boats could reach the most exotic, remote corners of the world without the need for expensive airfields, traveling to places even large ships couldn't access. While many American airlines focused on domestic routes within the continental U.S., Pan American founded by the dynamic entrepreneur Juan Trippe, focused on flying boat travel from America's coasts. Once again, government deals played a key role as Trippe secured a monopoly on U.S. mail contracts for routes to the Caribbean and South America. Trippe even enlisted the glamour of Charles Lindbergh to pilot a high-profile public relations stunt, an island-hopping flight around the Caribbean, to further cement the prestige of Pan American's flying boat service. Pan Am extended its routes down the coast of South America, making it fashionable for the wealthy to fly to Havana for a weekend getaway or to Rio for a holiday.
Here's a picture from the other side of the world, from Latin America. Probably the gayest of all carnivals, the wildest of all festivities is the annual fiesta in Rio de Janeiro. Who wouldn't be in Rio at carnival time?
The airline introduced ever larger flying boats, what it called clippers, and these aircraft became regular features in glamorous Hollywood movies. While the Atlantic route would have been the most profitable for flying boats, it was hampered by disputes over landing rights. European governments insisted that American carriers share the lucrative transatlantic routes with their own national airlines. Blocked in the Atlantic, Pan Am turned its attention to the Pacific. In 1931, Lindbergh once again piloted a flying boat to China and Japan via Alaska. A new route was planned, stretching across the Pacific, passing through Hawaii, America's possession in the Philippines, and then on to Hong Kong. Even the most advanced Pan Am clippers faced challenges with the vast distances of the Pacific. This required the development of new radio navigation equipment to locate the tiny coral islands that would serve as stopovers for the flying boats. As with past endeavors, political leverage played a crucial role in securing the necessary support for these ambitious routes. Pan Am even convinced the U.S. government to annex Wake Island, turning it into a vital flying boat base. When the first Pan Am scheduled flight crossed the Pacific in 1936, it marked a dramatic reduction in the time needed to travel, shrinking the world significantly. 3 days from San Francisco to Hong Kong, compared to the 3 weeks a sea voyage took. However, flying boats were still not the aircraft capable of supporting the mass travel we have today. To afford a round-trip fare from California to the Philippines, the average American would have to work for an entire year. Meanwhile, Germany, still deeply invested in airships, launched the Dornier DOX in 1929. This giant flying boat could carry 169 passengers, a record that wouldn't be surpassed for more than 15 years. Due to the restrictions of the post-World War I Versailles Treaty, which forbade Germany from building large aircraft, the DOX had to be constructed in Switzerland. Despite its size, the DOX was a heavy and unwieldy aircraft. In the end, only 3 DOX planes were built. Historians have called the Dornier DOX a plane ahead of its time, recognizing it as one of the most remarkable flying boats ever built, despite its shortcomings. Germany and France operated flying boats across the Mediterranean and even made crossings of the South Atlantic to South America. To address the challenge of refueling mid-ocean, Germany created ships that would meet their services in the Atlantic, providing fuel for their Brazil-bound flights. Britain introduced flying boats to its Imperial Airways services in 1929, connecting key points of the British Empire to South Africa, India, and Australia. A journey to Sydney could take up to 9 days. Despite the glamour of flying boat travel, often portrayed in the media, passengers sometimes describe their long flights as tiring and boring, with the excitement of flying fading quickly. The flights, which involved long hours in a metal cabin, frequently included stopovers where passengers would sleep in hotels before continuing their journey early the next morning. While flying boats were luxurious in comparison to the alternatives at the time, the reality of travel was less glamorous than it seemed. Planes were non-pressurized and had to fly through, not above, turbulent weather, causing discomfort, air sickness, and a less than ideal flying experience. In response, airlines began installing beds in their flying boats, but the overall experience remained far from the convenience and comfort we associate with air travel today. Britain overcame American resistance to landing rights by sending its flying boats to Canada. It wasn't until 4 years after the first Pacific flight that political barriers to transatlantic flights were cleared. In May 1939, Pan Am launched its first scheduled Clipper service from New York to Lisbon and Marseille, opening a vital link between America and Europe. Even as these transatlantic services began, it became clear that the key to making air travel commercially viable lay in larger aircraft. To that end, Pan Am ordered the largest airliners built at the time, which would remain the largest until the advent of the Boeing 747, more than 40 years later. Meanwhile, Britain was introducing its own large Empire flying boats, though the golden age of flying boats was already drawing to a close. Germany had already begun to build land-based aircraft capable of flying non-stop from Germany to New York. However, American refusal to grant landing rights to Germany effectively protected Pan Am's monopoly on transatlantic routes. The late 1930s saw the emergence of a variety of new airliners built from the decade-long progress in aviation technology. In the early 1930s, many airliners were still biplanes, with sturdy wooden frames and taut fabric stretched over cables, reminiscent of the very first Wright brothers aircraft. This was not due to a lack of innovation, but because biplanes provided the strength necessary to support larger hulls, making them ideal for the early commercial airliners. The larger biplanes of the 1930s allowed for more spacious cabins, offering features like padded vibration-dampening seats, beds, and kitchens, which provided a more comfortable and practical experience for passengers. These aircraft were still slow and ungainly, but the increased power of the engines meant that fewer engines were required, which reduced noise and vibration and enabled faster flight. A key innovation in aviation during this period was the advancement of aerodynamics, which focused on how air flows past objects and how these objects could be shaped to reduce drag and increase efficiency. While aerodynamics had already been applied to cars and trains, it was with aircraft that the wind tunnel science truly paid off, improving performance and fuel efficiency at high speeds. Throughout the 1930s, airlines and aircraft manufacturers focused on making air travel profitable through passenger services alone, eliminating the dependence on airmail contracts. The shift became crucial in 1934, when President Franklin Roosevelt's administration nationalized airmail and began using government-owned aircraft for these services. To create a viable modern airline service, aircraft had to be faster, capable of flying in all weather conditions, and reliable. Airlines also needed aircraft that were easy to maintain and service, setting the stage for the next wave of innovations in air travel. In the quest to make money from passengers, airlines realized that the key was keeping aircraft in the air for longer, minimizing downtime. Letters could afford delays, but business travelers who needed to keep appointments demanded reliable and timely services. The flying experience also had to be more comfortable to appeal to these passengers. In 1931, Boeing introduced the 247, which was the first airliner to truly resemble what we consider a modern aircraft today. It was a fast, all-metal monoplane, streamlined and powered by the most advanced engines of the time. Despite its innovation, however, the 247 did not achieve the commercial success Boeing had hoped for. This was due in part to the arrival of a competitor in 1934. The Douglas DC-3. The DC-3 built upon the technical advancements of the 247, but was larger, capable of carrying 40% more passengers. It was also designed for mass production, which made it cheaper to produce, easy to service, and reliable in terms of maintenance. This made it highly profitable. By 1939, the DC-3 was responsible for carrying 90% of the 3 million passengers flown annually in the United States. While the DC-3 was the most commercially successful of the 1930s airliners, the Lockheed Electra was regarded as the most stylish. It was faster than its competitors, and in 1938, American millionaire Howard Hughes made headlines by flying an Electra around the world in just 4 days. The Lockheed Electra, with its drag-reducing features like retractable landing gear, was a technological marvel of its time, offering both style and efficiency. Though the Douglas DC-3 proved to be the more commercially successful aircraft due to its larger capacity, the Electra remained a popular choice, especially for high-profile flights. One of the most significant moments in history involving the Electra came in 1938, when it was used to fly British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to meet Adolf Hitler in Munich. This event was a notable example of how air travel had transformed diplomacy. Previously, important international negotiations had been conducted via telegrams or formal conferences. However, air travel allowed world leaders to meet in person with unprecedented speed, altering the way negotiations were conducted. In this case, the Munich Agreement, in which European powers sought to avert war by appeasing Hitler, saw Chamberlain make 2 flights to Germany, one to discuss the crisis and another to meet Hitler again. It was also the first time Chamberlain, at 70 years old, had flown. This marked the beginning of a new era where air travel played a key role in shaping international relations, with leaders using it to conduct business and negotiations more swiftly and personally than ever before. Hitler himself utilized air travel for propaganda purposes, frequently depicted in newsreels as a modern leader, a man of the future, flying in his aircraft to bolster his image. This intersection of technology, diplomacy, and propaganda would come to define the political landscape in the lead-up to World War II. On the steps of a Lockheed Electra, Chamberlain waved a sheet of paper on which Hitler promised never to go to war. The scrap of paper was the result of a single, short, one-on-one meeting between Chamberlain and Hitler. How might history have unfolded had decisions been taken in the traditional way? With Chamberlain and his cabinet discussing letters and telegrams from a distance, rather than the British Prime Minister encountering the Nazi dictator's personal charisma and believing Hitler, who looked him in the eye and said, "Peace in our time." It was history made possible by air travel. When World War II began, manufacturers had a new generation of airliners waiting in development. The only problem left unsolved by the DC-3 generation of aircraft was of turbulence caused by flight at low altitude through the weather. To avoid the unpleasantness of air sickness, aircraft needed to fly above the weather in the thinner air of the newly discovered stratosphere, high above the Earth's surface. To do this, aircraft had to be pressurized with an artificial internal atmosphere, so passengers and crew could breathe and not freeze to death. Engines had to be redesigned to breathe thinner air. In 1939, Boeing planned to overtake Douglas with a plane they called the Stratocruiser. It had a pressurized cabin and new engines that could work in the stratosphere with newly refined, richer fuels. Boeing was not the only builders thinking this way. Germany's Fokker-Wulf Company had developed a high-altitude, long-range Condor airliner. Douglas planned an enlarged version of the DC-3, the 4-engined DC-4. Lockheed had a successor to the Electra, a long-range, high-altitude airliner in development. This last pre-war generation of aircraft would benefit from money poured into wartime development to convert them into efficient military transports. During the war, the already proven DC-3 would be turned into the C-47, the Dakota, a military transport plane delivering troops, paratroopers, and supplies all over the world. 322 DC-3 airliners were built, but 11,000 C-47s were built for the war. The fact that so many aircraft were built for the war meant manufacturers rose to previously unimaginable levels of expertise in building planes quickly and cheaply. Designers of both planes and engines learned how to solve problems fast. With the coming of peace, some pre-war ways of flying resumed. Britain's Empire flying boats resumed their journeys, but soon disappeared just a few years into the peace. When peace came, air travel was set to expand to a whole new level, and post-1945 international politics also meant many, though not all, of the old restrictions on airspace which protected national interests were removed. The same year, Howard Hughes launched the giant Hercules flying boat. Hughes was famously an eccentric. The huge plane was built of wood, which Hughes insisted remained the right material for aircraft construction. The media nicknamed the Hercules the Spruce Goose. The Spruce Goose was obsolete before she ever flew. Her one and only flight, with Hughes himself at the controls, was a brief moment in aviation history. The truth was that the time of the flying boat and the wooden plane was over. The immediate post-war years were the time when the propeller-powered airliner evolved into its ultimate form. Piston-driven propeller engines had become virtually as powerful as the laws of physics would allow. Airliners could now fly across oceans and continents without stops. They could fly at high altitude. They brought levels of comfort and speed that could finally beat anything ships or trains could offer. With the peace, the generation of airliners that had been waiting in 1939 and had matured during the war took to the air. The Boeing Stratocruiser was, even then, a plane that had 2 floors, with a staircase in between decks. The post-war Stratocruiser was a passenger fuselage between the wings, tails, and engines of the B-29 Stratofortress, a bomber designed to cross the vast spaces of the Pacific above the operational altitude of Japanese fighters. The Douglas DC-6 was originally developed as a long-range, large-capacity military transport and grew out of an enlarged DC-4, which was itself an enlarged 4-engine version of the DC-3. The definitive aircraft of the propliner age was the Lockheed Constellation. First on the drawing board in 1939, the aircraft had been enlarged and improved as a military transport during the war. There was little between the DC-6 Stratocruiser and Constellation in terms of performance, but the Constellation ranks as one of the most stylish aircraft ever to fly. In World War II, propeller-powered aircraft reached the limits of what they could do. This was true of military aircraft, and it would soon be true of the propeller airliner. The future lay with jet-powered flight. The jet engine was invented in the early 1930s by British RAF officer Frank Whittle. Whittle was largely ignored by the British aviation establishment, and it was in Germany that the first jet took off. Germany deployed the first operational jet fighters, soon to be followed by the RAF. Jets could fly faster and higher than propeller aircraft, with the world's air forces building jets. It was inevitable the new technology would turn to commercial air travel. Inevitable, but not immediate. air forces could afford the high cost of jets, which were thirsty for fuel, expensive, and difficult to maintain, but worth the money for superior fighting performance. Commercial aircraft had to be economic to operate. High investment in reliable prop airliners meant America was at first reluctant to pursue jet airliners. For a short period, a transitional generation of airliners emerged that were hybrids of jets and propeller planes. The turboprop. True jet aircraft drive the plane forward by shooting out a fast jet of gas. The turboprop instead uses the energy in the gas jet to turn a turbine, which itself turned a propeller. It gave the turboprop airliners higher altitude and some greater speed. But the turboprop airliners, such as the British Viscount, were only a halfway house. The future lay with pure jets. After Germany's defeat, Britain was in the forefront of jet development and saw an opportunity to establish a lead over America. In 1949, the British de Havilland Company began work on the world's first jetliner, the Comet. The plane entered service in 1952 on the British service to South Africa. The aircraft was an immediate success, faster and more comfortable than any prop liner, and it was a stylish, good-looking aircraft. Passengers fought for tickets, and airliners all over the world wanted Comets. Then, in 1954, Comets began to disintegrate in mid-air. It was found that the design was flawed, with structural weaknesses. The Comet fleet was grounded, and the plane had to be redesigned. Meanwhile, Boeing was designing a jetliner. Today, Boeing is one of the world's leading manufacturers of commercial aircraft. In the 1950s, they were some way behind their American rivals, Douglas and Lockheed, and best known as a military manufacturer. The U.S. government had given Boeing the money to design a large, long-range jet aircraft that would not fall apart, the giant intercontinental nuclear bomber, the B-52. Boeing applied this expertise to create an aircraft that was for both military use as a tanker and as a commercial airliner. The Boeing 707. While British engineers wrestled with the problems of the Comet, Boeing had the time to perfect the 707. With the Comet on the ground and back on the drawing board, the 707 had no competition. Even had there been a rival, the 707 would have been a hard act to beat. It could carry twice as many passengers as the Comet and flew at nearly 600 miles per hour, a speed identical to most of today's aircraft. It could fly long distances without stopping to refuel. The 707 was robust, reliable, and economic. Its airframe is so strong that it could be placed into a barrel roll, flying upside down like a fighter jet, though this maneuver was never performed with passengers aboard. The 707's speed and range literally cut the size of the world in half. The first 707s entered service in 1958 and immediately dominated the market. The year before the 707 flew, the number of passengers crossing the Atlantic by air had already overtaken those traveling by sea. Already, some airlines were contemplating an uncertain future. Worried there would be more seats on planes than they could fill, prices for air travel began to fall, and the industrialized world was riding a wave of prosperity. Its people were richer than ever. Cheap air travel was to become part of this new lifestyle. In less than 60 years, the world has gone from being flightless to standing on the edge of a new age, the age of mass air travel.
In 1966, the aviation community celebrated the remarkable contributions of British aviation pioneer Sir Frank Whittle to the industry. A quarter of a century earlier, this visionary aeronautical engineer had revolutionized air travel with his groundbreaking invention of the jet engine. On May 15, 1941, an experimental Gloster E-2839, powered by Whittle's W1 jet engine, soared into the skies above Cranwell, flying for 17 minutes and achieving a top speed of 545 kilometers an hour. By the war's end, the Gloster Meteor had shattered world speed records, reaching an astonishing 975.46 kilometers an hour. Sir Frank Whittle, alongside German inventor Hans von Ahyn, accelerated the evolution of jet aircraft, making them the preferred choice for long-range travel in just a few decades. While the 1930s epitomised luxury in air travel, the 1950s witnessed a surge in faster and more affordable flights, democratising air travel for countless individuals. Whittle's groundbreaking achievements propelled British aerospace to the forefront of the aviation industry. American companies concentrated on piston engine airliners, leaving the field free for the British to race ahead with jet technology.
Once again, the eyes of the world turn to Britain as aircraft manufacturers stage the greatest flying show on earth at Farnborough in Hampshire.
By 1952, Britain was experiencing a surge of national pride, fueled by its rapid advancements in jet technology. The pinnacle of these achievements was showcased at the prestigious Farnborough Air Show, featuring standout aircraft such as the Supermarine Swift, the Gloster Javelin, and the Handley Page Victor, alongside tantalising glimpses of future airliners.
The Bristol Britannia, a turbojet capable of carrying 104 passengers, will soon be in regular service. Now the Victor, Britain's crescent-wing bomber. Powered by 4 Sapphire jet engines, it's already in super priority production for the RAF. Few details have been released about the Victor, but there seems little doubt it's intended as Britain's #1 atom bomber. Huge delta-wing Avro Vulcan. Britain pioneered and perfected the delta-wing design. Now the Flying Darts, Avro 707s, the fighters from which the Vulcan was developed, form up in escort. Farnborough, our showplace of the air, proves once more that Britain is leading the world into this new jet age. As we looked at the latest aircraft that have swept Britain to the forefront of aviation.
However, the journey wasn't without its challenges for Britain's high-performance jets. During the air show, pilot John Derry was demonstrating the capabilities of the de Havilland 110 fighter. Just 4 years earlier, Derry had made history as the first British pilot to break the sound barrier in a British aircraft.
But those who watched during those 5 days could never know the feelings of the men whose job it was to take an aircraft through the sound barrier again and again. And perhaps as we thrilled to their daring, we almost forgot that on each and every flight, death flew with them. But those who were there on the 6th day will never forget. For it was on that day that a fault developed in Derry's black aircraft, and he and his observer flew in another. The aircraft broke through the sound barrier and then flew low over the airfield. Now the split-second disaster in slow motion.
Tragically, as Derry initiated a climb, the wings of the aircraft failed, causing the engines to detach and plummet to the ground. While one engine landed without incident, the other crashed into a crowd of spectators, resulting in devastating consequences, killing 29 people and many more were injured. An investigation found that the de Havilland's D-nose leading edge arrangement was unsuited to the stresses of supersonic flight in such a heavy aircraft. The tragic incident prompted a widespread overhaul of safety regulations governing airshows.
The heavy death roll is mute testimony of the dreadful tragedy. Almost at once, Derry's friend Neville Duke flew a Hawker Hunter through the sound barrier again. Flying, like progress, must not stop. John Derry was an explorer in an unknown world, whose barriers can only be penetrated by such men as he. Their courage and skill have won us great victories in the skies, and they will go on.
In the years following World War II, Britain's aeronautical industry thrived. The Vickers VC-1 Viking exemplified a new era of passenger aircraft design. Derived from the Vickers Wellington bomber, this twin-piston engine short-range airliner served airlines worldwide for many years. Crucially, for jet propulsion development, a modified Viking equipped with Rolls-Royce Nene turbojets emerged as Britain's first pure jet transport aircraft in 1948. However, the initial British passenger jets introduced into service were powered by turboprop engines. With the Americans focused on piston engine airliners, the British enjoyed a wide open field for advancement with the release of the Vickers Viscount and the Bristol Britannia. Turboprop engines harness the high-temperature gas within a jet engine to propel the propellers, delivering superior power and speed compared to piston engines, along with enhanced fuel efficiency compared to turbojets. Advancements in technology elevated support roles to a more technical level.
For example, to keep each airliner in the air today, over 100 workers are needed on the ground. But the safety of operations also depends upon the proper maintenance of planes. For this reason, many skilled mechanics must be employed. Their work is highly specialized, and those who direct or supervise such work must hold a federal government certificate and ratings depending upon the type of work they do. For example, mechanics qualified to supervise work on general maintenance, including dismantling, welding, or fabricating, must hold what is called an A, or aircraft certificate. Others, who supervise and approve engine work only, are required by the Civil Aeronautics Authority to hold an E, or engine certificate. But no matter what their chosen field may be, regular apprenticeship courses or equivalent technical schooling is required.
BOAC, Britain's premier airline, leveraged turboprops throughout the 1950s, exploiting their increased power and range to pioneer non-stop global flights.
Emerging from the war with tremendous military air strength, but little civilian, our airlines have since then been striving to make up for lost time. Informed observers of the British aviation scene believe that the United Kingdom has two trump cards to play in her bid for leadership in the sky. The bold, far-sighted policy of executives like Whitney Straight and her acknowledged genius in the design of new aircraft and engines. They point to Britain's intensive pioneering of gas turbines, prime movers which will outstrip by many hundreds of miles an hour the speeds accepted in present timetables.
Intense competition characterized the aviation market, with nations like France and India striving to offer the most luxurious travel experiences.
For you, the new pleasure of travel in the latest luxury airliners, twice as fast, with personnel whose courteous attention is world famous.
I think we ought to have the lettering much bigger. Air India, the route of the magic carpet.
A diplomat, a movie siren, a world-renowned musician is usually aboard, and maybe sitting beside you. And remember, breakfast in bed.
Britain, committed to leading the aviation industry, introduced the world's inaugural turboprop aircraft in 1948. The Vickers Viscount, a medium-range airliner manufactured at the Vickers factory in Weybridge, epitomised this innovation. Quieter and smoother than piston engine counterparts, the Viscount accommodated approximately 50 passengers and soared to become one of the most favoured airliners. A total of 445 Viscounts were manufactured and distributed to airlines worldwide. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Dart Mark 525 turboprop engines, the Viscount boasted an operational altitude of 25,000 feet. Later variants featured a new fuel system, a 2-pilot cockpit, more powerful engines, and increased weight. In 1949, the Bristol Brabazon took to the skies, a 100-seater airliner developed for the transatlantic market. Unfortunately, despite its promising start, the airplane never entered mass production, and the prototype was dismantled for scrap. The Bristol Type 175 Britannia turboprop, affectionately known as the Whispering Giant, earned its moniker for its serene and smooth flight experience. Although it made its maiden flight in 1952, setbacks, including the loss of 2 prototypes to icing issues, delayed its official launch until 1957. As a result, only 85 Britannias were manufactured. Yet the aircraft garnered widespread acclaim as one of the finest turboprop airliners ever engineered. BOAC procured 18 of these long-range airliners out of the 312 produced, pioneering non-stop transatlantic flights between London and New York in both directions. Additionally, the Royal Air Force operated several Bristol Britannias, utilising them until 1975, when they were retired from military service and sold to various African, Middle Eastern and European airlines, which operated them until the 1980s. Meanwhile, behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was making significant strides in jet airliner technology. The arrival of the Tupolev Tu-114 at the Paris Air Show in 1959 astounded Western observers with its imposing size and advanced features. The airplane features swept-back wings at 35 degrees. Its Kuznetsov NK-12 MV turboprops were the most powerful ever made, and its landing gear was exceptionally long because of the huge propellers.
The world's largest airliner with seats for up to 220 people, a range of 6,000 miles, so that it can fly easily from Moscow to New York non-stop. Well, the Russians have been photographing our planes in great detail while they've been here, so now no doubt they're going to allow us the privilege of taking a few pictures of theirs.
The Tu-114 served on international routes until it was surpassed by the Ilyushin IL-62 and reassigned to domestic flights. Later, it was repurposed for military use, operating in the Soviet Army and Air Force until 1991. Despite the efficiency of turboprops in passenger aviation, Britain remained eager to incorporate turbojets into its commercial fleet. In 1952, BOAC introduced the de Havilland Comet, the world's inaugural jetliner and a symbol of British aviation prowess. The American business magazine Fortune hailed 1953 as the year of the coronation and the Comet. Distinct from the clamour of piston engines, the Comet emitted a distinctive high-pitched whine during approach. Cruising at altitudes of up to 40,000 feet, passengers enjoyed pressurised comfort.
Early in the year, a brilliant new all-British achievement made headline news throughout the world. The Comet made its debut on a journey from London Airport to Johannesburg. 4 de Havilland Ghost jet engines power this mighty passenger-carrying craft that the British Overseas Airways Corporation have adopted for their major air services. The Comet was soon airborne for its first historic flight, London to Johannesburg, a journey of more than 6,000 miles. Quickly and smoothly, the Comet climbed to 40,000 feet. At some 500 miles an hour, the Comet flashed over Europe. Always a new land, a new country to be seen, no time to be bored with the journey. Soon the Alps were below. Speed, reliability and comfort, these are among the Comet's greatest assets, backed by BOAC service second to none. Stewardess Audrey Cartmel looked after the passengers. High over Africa it flew, then below, white patches showing where gold had been wrested from the earth told the passengers that they'd reached their destination. This was Johannesburg. The Comet had made the 6,000-mile journey in 23 hours and 40 minutes, less than a day from London. The Comet's achievement thrilled the world and set higher than ever before the prestige of British aircraft and airways in this jet age.
Unfortunately, Britain's aviation future faced unforeseen challenges. In its debut year, one Comet suffered damage and another failed to become airborne due to an issue with the leading edge of its wings. Tragically, worse incidents were to follow. In May 1953, a Comet crashed during a tropical storm just 6 minutes after departing Calcutta Airport in India. Initially attributed to adverse weather, the crash raised concerns. Then, in January 1954, another comet exploded at 30,000 feet en route from Rome to London, marking a devastating turn of events. There was no obvious explanation for the crash, which killed 35 people. Investigators ordered some modifications before allowing the airplane back into service, but they had no real idea what caused the accident. 3 months later, another tragic incident unfolded as yet another comet disintegrated over the Mediterranean. The entire fleet faced an immediate and indefinite grounding, while experts delved into the root cause of these calamities. Leading the investigation was Sir Arnold Hall, a distinguished aeronautical engineer renowned for his contributions, including designing the compressor for Frank Whittle's pioneering jet engine. The Ministry of Civil Aviation constructed a massive tank, spacious enough to accommodate a comet, and filled it with water to replicate the atmospheric pressure experienced at 35,000 feet. Through exhaustive testing, Hall determined that metal fatigue lay at the heart of the comet disasters, stemming from the recurrent pressurization and depressurization of the aircraft cabin. Further analysis revealed that the window supports were punch-riveted rather than bonded, exacerbating the structural vulnerabilities. Consequently, the Comet underwent significant redesign, with the insights gained informing safety improvements across the aviation industry. In a curious aside to the investigation, novelist and aeronautical engineer Nevil Shute briefly served at the de Havilland Aircraft Company in the early 1920s, adding an unexpected dimension to the narrative. In 1948, he published No Highway, a best-selling thriller about an aircraft engineer who becomes convinced that a new airliner type is fatally flawed due to metal fatigue. Nevil Shute christened his fictional airliner The Reindeer, sparking speculation that the novelist was subtly expressing concerns about the Comet's design in a veiled manner, given the association of Comet with one of Father Christmas's reindeer. In 1951, Shute's book was adapted into the widely acclaimed film No Highway in the Sky, featuring James Stewart and Marlene Dietrich. With the Comet sidelined, the Soviet Tupolev Tu-114 stood as the sole civilian turbojet operating passenger routes. Derived from the Tu-16 Badger strategic bomber, the Tu-104 underwent rigorous pressure testing in a water tank before entering service with the Soviet national airline Aeroflot in 1956. Meanwhile, British firm Avro set its sights on transatlantic markets. On September 1, 1950, Avro unveiled the Avro Ashton, an experimental jet airliner propelled by 4 Rolls-Royce Nene 6 turbojets. Insights gleaned from the Ashton project were integrated into the development of the Avro C-102, manufactured in Canada and marking the first civilian jet aircraft to land in the United States.
In Toronto's Malton Airport, a Canadian Avro jetliner, a 4-jet 60-passenger transport, takes off with a cargo of mail, climbs quickly to 20,000 feet, and heads for New York. "59 minutes later, she zooms over Idlewild Airport, cutting in half previous airline records for the 370-mile trip. The plane, called Canada's idea of a better mousetrap in the aviation field, is the first jetliner to carry international airmail in this hemisphere. On Rome's Ciampino Airfield...
Nevertheless, Britain remained resolute in reclaiming its dominance with a revamped Comet. The government extolled the virtues of the new airliner, investing considerable effort in linking the successes of previous aircraft to the anticipated triumph of the Comet. Mindful of the public confidence shattered by the early Comet tragedies, de Havilland dedicated several years to meticulously refining the new design. Despite pressure to change the name and create distance from the earlier model, de Havilland stood by the brand and by 1957 had produced the Comet Mark IV. The new Comet model underwent a meticulous inspection process, including rigorous pressure testing in a water tank, supplemented by hydraulic rams exerting additional stress on the wings. The setback experienced by the Comet proved to be a fortunate turn for the American aviation industry, which seized the opportunity to bridge the gap with its groundbreaking Boeing 707 jetliner. Derived from the military KC-135 Stratotanker, the 707 boasted 70% more power than the Comet, accommodating 179 passengers and double the fuel capacity. Eager to secure a foothold in the lucrative transatlantic market, the Boeing 707 arrived in the United Kingdom for testing in preparation for launching flights between Britain and the United States.
The biggest, the heaviest and the fastest airliner flies into London Airport. It's the Boeing 707, America's rival to the Comet 4 in the race to provide the first jet airline service over the Atlantic. The Boeing, its 4 jet engines screened by huge silencers, is here to pass noise tests before it can use the airport. The massive interior will carry 165 economy-class passengers, flying at heights that make individual oxygen supplies necessary for emergency use.
Galvanized by the American competition, de Havilland pressed forward with the Comet. Despite its shorter range compared to the 707, BOAC committed to purchasing 20 aircraft, recognizing that the Comet's ability to operate from existing runways and reach numerous smaller airports along BOAC's routes was advantageous. This marked the beginning of the end for BOAC's piston engine fleet. According to pilot John Cunningham, despite its advanced technology, the new aircraft proved to be more user-friendly than its predecessors.
How does she compare with the earlier Comets?
Well, it's very much more lively, having more than twice the power of the earlier Comet. Its flying qualities are much improved over the earlier Comets, partly as a result of the last 8 years' flying experience on Comets. And generally, I think it's an easier aeroplane to fly than the earlier Comets.
Are you absolutely confident that you straighten out the problems that caused the early Comet disaster?
Yes, absolutely. We've learnt an enormous amount, of course, in the last 8 years, and particularly in the last 4 years, as a result of the Comet inquiries. A lot of research and development work has been made on structures, and we have today in the Mark IV an aeroplane that embodies really all the best experience that any manufacturer has had.
The Comet features simplified controls to aid flight crews in managing the increased takeoff and landing speeds. Its inaugural challenge came in the form of the race to conquer the Atlantic. Pan Am was confident its 707 would be the first, but BOAC had a surprise in store.
It was a great race and Britain won it. Comet 4 Delta Charlie flies into New York, the first jet to carry fare-paying passengers across the Atlantic. And Comet 4 Delta Bravo clinched the victory with a record non-stop west-east flight in 6 hours, 7 minutes on the same day. The first commercial jet service across the Atlantic is established, and BOAC are flying it. For the 28 passengers, it was a great occasion. But for the team who flew her and the men who built her, Delta Bravo's capture of the blue ribbon of the Atlantic Airways was final triumph. Such men as her captain, Tom Story, and the man whose genius created her, designer Tim Wilkins. Mr. Wilkins, you designed a wonderful aeroplane. Have you had much in the way of trouble on the way?
Well, we had, of course, our full measure of troubles, the Comet 1, which was designed some time ago, and was, of course, a very big step forward in the aviation airline business. Anyway, after the troubles, we did decide to carry on with the Comet and retain the name and bring it back.
Comet's story stretches back into the war, when Britain's all-out effort to produce fighting aircraft gave her no chance to develop civil types. But Sir Frank Whittle's first jet engine gave the opportunity to forge ahead again. For 13 years, development of the Comet went ahead at de Havilland's. First, Comet 1 and failure. Then, the bigger, faster, safer and better Comet 4. But America's research was bounding forward, and after the setback to Comet 1, it looked as though the Boeing 707 would be first across the Atlantic. Everyone believed the race had gone to the United States, and Pan American spent an estimated £500,000 advertising the first transatlantic jet service. Everyone believed it except de Havilland's and BOAC, and they'd a surprise up their sleeves. Early delivery of not 1 but 3 Comets. And that did it. more than a month ahead of their own schedule and 3 weeks in front of the Boeing's expected entry into service, BOAC sent off the first regular jet service across the Atlantic. Yes, Comet 4's in business. Britain's aircraft industry can chalk up its greatest post-war triumph.
As well as the Comet 4, Britain was counting on another jetliner to keep it in the forefront of the jet race.
So George, what can the VC-10 do?
Well, the passenger accommodation varies between 108 and 150 people according to the class of layout. Cruising speeds in the 600 mile an hour class. Cruising height between 40 and 50,000 feet according to the length of the trip. The range, London, New York, non-stop.
Why are the engines on the fuselage and not on the wing?
Because the aeroplane has to be better than the American jet, which will be in service some years before it. And the biggest problem in these big jets is aerodrome performance. If you keep the engines away from the wing so that you've got them pulled back with a clean wing, you can develop a takeoff performance of the aeroplane much superior to the one which you have with the engines on the wing. You have a completely clean, unbroken leading and trailing edge flat, and you get out of difficult aerodromes at greater weights.
What about for the passengers? Is there any improvement for them?
Yes, so there's going to be a big advantage in passenger comfort because the noise and vibration, whatever there is behind them, and forward of that line, say, the interior is going to be pretty quiet.
The VC-10 and the imposing Vickers Vanguard turboprop emerged as heralds of the aviation future.
Mock-up of the Vickers Armstrong VC-10 indicates the shape of things to come in British airliners. The cost of the mock-up is £500,000, showing that building large airliners is a big money business. The VC-10 will carry a maximum of 150 passengers at about 600 miles an hour, the power being provided by 4 Rolls-Royce Conway engines. It will be in the air by 1961. The engineers concerned believe that engines mounted in the rear are best. But the VC-10 isn't the only aircraft built at Weybridge. There's the Vanguard too. Turboprop, twice as big as the famous Viscount, it will fly on BEA routes next summer. The VC-10 could reduce tourist fares by 50%. Roll on the day when it's in the air.
The Vickers VC-10 was slated to revolutionise air travel as the premier large jet airliner equipped with 4 rear-mounted engines. Produced at the British Aircraft Corporation's Weybridge facility, this 150-passenger aircraft aimed to claim the title of the world's most potent airliner. Positioning its 4 Rolls-Royce Conway 301 turbofan engines at the rear substantially mitigated cabin noise. Additionally, the aircraft boasted a reinforced frame with over half composed of solid steel and alloys, along with fully redundant systems to bolster safety and reliability. Despite fervent marketing efforts to showcase the VC-10's prowess, especially amid increasing American competition, Vickers faced precarious financial circumstances due to tepid demand for the jetliner. The British government intervened, pressuring BOAC to expand its orders to enable Vickers to break even, if not turn a profit. BOAC harboured reservations regarding the VC-10's fuel efficiency, especially upon discovering that the Boeing 707 boasted a lower cost of £4.10 per passenger mile compared to the VC-10's £4.24. This revelation, which found its way into the media, eroded customer confidence in Vickers. Ultimately, BOAC placed orders for 12 standard VC-10s and 35 Super VC-10s, although it scaled back its standard order to 7 by 1964 as airline expansion stagnated. The British government bought the excess VC-10s and used them as military transports for many years. The Super VC-10 introduced enhancements such as an additional fuel tank in the fuselage and adjustments to engine positioning, effectively addressing issues with tailplane buffeting and fatigue related to thrust reverser operation. Despite the political complexities surrounding its development, the VC-10 swiftly garnered popularity within BOAC's fleet, acclaimed by both passengers and crew for its reduced noise levels and heightened interior comfort. Derived from the Vickers Viscount, the Vickers Vanguard represented a significant evolution. Its redesigned fuselage boasted a double bubble cross-section, maximising internal space and augmenting cargo capacity. Powered by new Rolls-Royce Tyne engines, the Vanguard attained cruising altitudes of 30,000 feet, establishing itself as one of the swiftest turboprops ever constructed. Notably, the 4 engines demonstrated exceptional reliability and efficiency, facilitating a range of nearly 3,000 kilometres. Unlike earlier aircraft, the Vanguard's wings contained integrally machined skins of light alloy to provide span-wise stiffening at low cost, and 3 shear webs rather than the single spar in the Viscount wing. Operating the airplane demanded considerable physical strength, as all flight controls were manually operated without power assistance. Additionally, adjusting thrust resulted in significant yaw, given that all 4 sizable propellers rotated in unison. Regrettably, by the time Vanguards entered the market, turbojets had surged in popularity, leading to limited demand for the colossal turboprop. Trans-Canada Airlines and DEA stood as the sole customers, with only 43 Vanguards ever manufactured. Nevertheless, BEA Vanguards proved invaluable on bustling European and UK trunk routes, boasting 139 passenger seats. Despite initial challenges, the Vanguard proved to be remarkably profitable. On shorter distances, it even matched the travel times of jets servicing the same routes. With increased passenger capacity, ticket prices plummeted, prompting a shift in travel habits as people began considering medium to long-distance flights over driving. Airline travel started to become accepted as a fact of everyday life. Despite the challenges faced by the British aviation industry, the government seized the opportunity to host the King of Nepal on a highly publicised tour of the Vickers Armstrong factory during his visit to England in 1960. Welcomed by Brigadier Generals Charles Dunphy and Sir George Edwards, the King was escorted to the Vanguard assembly area and presented with completed aircraft on the tarmac. While media attention primarily focused on the civilian airliners, the primary objective of the visit was to showcase Vickers Armstrong's array of military hardware, a cornerstone of Britain's vital export industry. The British Aircraft Corporation 111 emerged as the second short-haul jetliner to enter service, undergoing testing in the early 1960s. Tragically, the prototype met with disaster on October 22, 1963, resulting in the loss of all lives on board. Subsequent investigation revealed the occurrence of a deep stall attributed to diminished airflow to the tailplane due to the obstructive effect of the aft-mounted engine nacelles at high angles of attack, impeding the aircraft's ability to recover normal flight. Stick shakers and stick pushers were added to the control system, and the wing's leading edge was redesigned to smooth airflow into the engines and over the tailplane. Another test variant experienced a rough landing at the Wesley Test Centre, resulting in severe damage to its landing gear and undercarriage. Despite this setback, the airliner proceeded into production and enjoyed a successful career as a commercial transport for many years. The pioneering jet airliner to enter production in continental Europe was the Sud Aviation Caravelle from France. This graceful twin-engine turbojet made its maiden flight in 1955 and commenced service 4 years later on the Paris-Rome-Istanbul route. With a seating capacity of up to 128 passengers in a single-class configuration and manned by a flight crew consisting of 2 pilots and 1 engineer, the Caravelle epitomised efficiency and elegance in air travel. Although initially trailing in jet airliner development, Lockheed's propeller-driven airliner, the Constellation, emerged as one of the most beloved post-war passenger aircraft.
Now watch this. Feather 1.
Feather 1.
Feather 2.
Feather 2.
Look at that, on 2 engines.
Purring along just like a kitten. You haven't seen anything yet. Feather 3.
Feather 3.
Boy, oh boy, look at that. On one engine. Going along just as steady as you like. Only a Constellation could do this. Why do we have all that tremendous reserve of power? 'Cause, my friends, power means safety. That's why this Super Constellation is the most dependable airliner in the world today. Okay, Hugh, bring in 1.
Unfeathering 1.
As the first widely used pressurized airliner, the Connie graced the fleets of airlines worldwide.
Gear down. Gears coming down.
Eastern 601, clear to land. The captain will reverse the pitch of the propellers and push the air forward and just stop the plane. There. You see, that acts as a powerful brake. So next time when you're riding in an airliner and you hear the engines roar soon after you're on the ground, remember that's what he's doing, reversing the props to stop the airplane.
Maintaining its relevance throughout the 1940s and 1950s, until the emergence of jet transport ultimately led to its retirement. Jets revolutionized mass transportation, ushering in a new era of air travel accessibility and efficiency. America envisaged a golden future for its new Boeing 707 airliner.
1000's destination, London. Luggage was prepared for loading, and all other routine pre-flight activities were taking place. 1000 seemed to be just another flight to London, in all respects except that its passenger list was twice as large as on ordinary trips. Flight 1000 was airborne, but no plane was used. This was the first of so-called airline paper flights, a complete simulation of an actual flight that's been repeated more than 2,000 times since. The reason? To prepare for the revolution in transportation that is now here, the advent of commercial flying by Jet Clipper. In those early days, weather information for Flight 1000 and all the other paper jet flights was gathered as carefully as if real jets were to cross the Atlantic, gaining invaluable advance information about jet travel. For example, it is now known that at the altitudes at which jets cruise, generally 30 to 40,000 feet, flying will be above the weather. After years of paper flights like number 1000 and many hundreds of real flights with prototypes, the jet age is now here. The jet age begins before takeoff, at the airline's new terminal, now under construction at Idlewild Airport, New York. Jets are parked around it, as in this model. Passengers will board by walking along a covered ramp directly to the cabin level. Ground transportation delivers travelers directly to check-in counters. The circular design of the terminal, along with its unique cantilever roof, will assure speed of service and convenience for passengers. This is it. the first American commercial jet capable of economical transatlantic service, the Boeing 707 Jet Clipper. First to go aboard cargo and mail. Cargo shipments will be able to reach Europe in just 6.5 hours. A letter posted in London or Paris after the close of business may arrive in New York the same night and be waiting for the addressee at his breakfast table or office the next morning. Speed is a byword for every part of jet operations, since with some arrangements of seats, more than 150 passengers can be accommodated, there is an entrance at the back and the front, while plane servicing facilities are on the far side. One indication of the staggering impact of jet travel, every one of the airline's dozens of jet planes can carry as many people in a year's time as the biggest ocean liner.
The Boeing 707 boasted 35-degree swept-back wings and was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojets, representing the pinnacle of aviation technology. However, before the 707 could enter into service, there were still challenges to overcome.
More jet news from Seattle, USA, where the new Boeing jet airliner, America's challenge to the Comet, is all set for her first taxiing tests. All seems well with the 95-ton giant, then a sudden collapse as the port landing gear buckles. Fire trucks race to the scene as the pilot and crew scramble out of the damaged aircraft. The jetliner cost nearly £6 million to build. Experts fear that its first test flight will be delayed many weeks.
As the design underwent refinement, excitement and anticipation mounted.
Takeoff, without any need for engine warm-up, with outside noise now reduced to no more than that of propeller-driven planes, capable of traveling at 575 miles per hour or more, much higher and faster than you've ever flown before. The first passenger jet clipper to fly the Atlantic. Because of its greater size and speed, it will do the job of several of the biggest propeller-driven planes. Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard the spacious cabin, attractively decorated, air-conditioned but draft-free. Newly designed individual overhead light units are an innovation. Roominess extends even to the powder rooms, which look like those in a private home. And a new sensation, complete absence of vibration. Near sonic speed, but inside one of the most stunning discoveries. There is no feeling of movement at all, no vibration, hardly any sound. A new concept in air transportation. The travail has been taken out of travel.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're now at cruising altitude, 35,000 feet. Our flying speed is 575 miles per hour. In addition, we're benefiting from a substantial tailwind by courtesy of the jet stream. Hence, our ground speed is now approximately 658 miles per hour. Indications are that our arrival at London Airport may be ahead of schedule. I'll be speaking with you again from time to time. Thank you.
Despite being edged out by the unexpected transatlantic crossing of the Comet 4, the Boeing 707-120 made its debut on October 26, 1958, just 22 days later, with an impressive flight from New York to Paris, including a fuel stop in Newfoundland. The 707 quickly overshadowed British jetliners in popularity, but a series of unfortunate incidents less than a year later shook public confidence in the airliner. The jet encountered a string of mishaps, including emergency landings prompted by failures in the hydraulic system. One crippled aircraft was captured on film landing at Idlewild Airport, trailing a dramatic plume of flames as it came to a stop. Despite the precautionary deployment of emergency slides, most passengers disembarked via the stairs. The day before, a Qantas 707 had suffered an engine failure 150 miles out to sea. Fortunately, the aircraft with 82 people on board was able to make it safely to land on the other 3 engines. The first major accident involving the Boeing 707 occurred on August 17, 1959, when a test flight ended tragically with a crash shortly after takeoff on Long Island, New York, claiming the lives of all 5 crew members. Rescue teams worked diligently to salvage as much wreckage as possible to aid in the investigation, which was spearheaded by the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Board. Investigators determined that the pilots were conducting simulations of engine failure on 2 engines on one side when the accident occurred. In response to the findings, the Federal Aviation Authority implemented a new regulation stipulating that exercises involving 2 engine failures could not be conducted below 5,000 feet. Amid concerns that the flagship airliner might suffer a fate similar to the ill-fated Comet, some policymakers advocated for grounding the 707. However, Boeing staunchly defended its jetliner.
Saturday's Long Island crash, when the crew of 5 were killed, followed more than a dozen incidents ranging from minor electrical faults to landing gear trouble and wheels dropping off. These facts were put by our reporter Douglas Brown to a Boeing Airplane Company executive, Mr. Bromwich.
Well, it is true that we've had a certain number of difficulties with the 707, but these troubles have not fallen into any pattern. That is, there haven't been any consistent troubles with the 707. We have had some hydraulic system troubles, but as far as the major incidents are concerned, they've all been a little bit different one from the other. So we can't say that we have a family of troubles here that we can really work on.
Awful lot of them, though, hasn't there?
Well, I suppose so, but every airplane that's introduced into service has difficulties at first. We probably have had a little bit more publicity than the other people have had because, after all, it's a new device, and people are interested in what happens to transportation devices. Witness the headlines that occurred when the Queen Mary ran into, or was it a freighter ran into the Queen Mary?
Influential people in the United States themselves have called for the aircraft to be grounded.
Well, of course, we had a member of the House of Representatives call for it to be grounded, but there are 486 members of the House of Representatives, and I'm sure that out of these 486 people, you could find at least one who likes to get his name in the paper.
Is there anything in the criticism that the 707s should have been tested more on the ground before they were allowed into the air?
Well, from the Boeing airplane point of view, I don't know what we could have done. We've spent an awful lot of money on the airplane. We've actually started designing the airplane in 1952 and first flew the airplane in 1954. We have spent a great deal of money on it, and as we look back on the thing, I don't know that anybody in the company could say that there are things that we shouldn't have done in the way of testing.
Despite the setbacks, Boeing maintained a dominant position in the aviation industry. However, Douglas Aircraft was swiftly gaining ground with its own 4-engine jetliner, the DC-8. With Boeing beginning deliveries to Pan American Airways in October 1958, Douglas accelerated its testing schedule, sending 10 aircraft for certification by the Federal Aviation Administration by August 1959. A number of remedial works were carried out, including replacing air brakes with engine thrust reversers and adding leading-edge slots to improve low-speed lift. In September 1959, the first DC-8 entered into commercial service with Delta Airlines and United. 2 years later, a DC-8 achieved the milestone of becoming the first civilian jet to achieve supersonic flight. Although the Boeing 707 was often considered the superior aircraft, the DC-8 demonstrated remarkable staying power. By 2002, of the 1,032 707s manufactured for non-military use, only 80 remained in active service. In contrast, of the 556 DC-8s produced, approximately 200 were still in commercial operation, with some serving as cargo planes. Nevertheless, the era of jet aviation was undeniably dominated by Boeing. Throughout the 1960s, the aerospace giant solidified its hold on the American market and expanded its influence globally.
After 84 minutes, the first flight ends, and congratulations go to the pilot for blazing a new trail in the sky.
He was one of the richest men. He owned a studio. Girls were flocking to him. He was eccentric, there's no question about it. He wasn't crazy. It may have been strange in that he had so damn much money. He probably made the greatest aviation picture ever made, Hell's Angels.
Planes and the aviation industry were his first love.
Oh, he loved machines more than he did people, really.
Hughes was a man who lived on his ability to get along because they would make exceptions for him.
He was wealthy and he was powerful, and he had cash.
And he'd say, well, just remember, there's no one that I can't buy or destroy.
He was, for all intents and purposes, an inmate because he was a prisoner of his own fears.
He wanted me to be in constant touch with him. And I'd always, I just spoke to the poorest man in the world.
Howard Hughes was born in Houston, Texas on Christmas Eve 1905. Amidst the thriving Texas oil industry, his father, abandoning his law practice, embraced the life of a wildcat. Initially struggling in the oil business, Hughes Sr. took odd jobs just to sustain the family. However, his fortunes changed when he acquired a wooden prototype of Rock Eater, an innovative oil drilling bit capable of penetrating thick rock layers, a common frustration for oilmen. After successful manufacturing and testing, Hughes Sr. partnered with another and established the Sharp Hughes Tool Company. Meanwhile, Howard's overprotective mother showered him with excessive attention while his father was busy with business affairs.
His mother was a very powerful influence on him. Partly, I think, as much as anybody, helped instill this sort of lifelong phobia or fear, anyway, of germs.
At the age of 16, Howard was away at school when he learned that his mother had died during surgery. 2 years later, Howard's father died of a heart attack.
When that happened, Hughes began to exhibit all the traits that you would see throughout his life. That very strong-willed character, that tremendous streak of independence. Nobody's going to tell me what to do with my money or how to run my various enterprises. All of those things that really dominated him as an adult manifested themselves very quickly, much to the surprise and anger, by the way, of the other family members.
He was smart enough at age 19 to go before a judge in Houston, convince the judge that he was sophisticated enough to buy his uncle, who also had ownership in Hughes Tool, at which time he became the sole owner of Hughes Tool.
But he wanted control from day one, from the time he was 19, 20 years old, which was the one word, if you were going to describe the man from day one to the end, was control. He wanted to control everything.
Howard, now in charge, married socialite Ella Rice and embarked on a journey to Hollywood. Captivated by its allure, with the guidance of his uncle, screenwriter Rupert Hughes, he entered the film industry's elite circles. The couple settled into a luxurious Spanish-style residence on fashionable Murrayfield Road. Hollywood society embraced him, but secretly referred to him as the sucker with the money. Hughes delved deeper into the intricacies of making movies, devoting months to film sets to absorb technical knowledge. He would spend entire evenings dismantling film projectors, driven by an obsession to grasp every detail of the industry. Adopting a lifelong habit, Hughes abandoned wearing a watch, blurring the boundaries between day and night. During his waking hours, which knew no bounds, he toiled relentlessly for up to 40 hours without rest, pausing only for occasional sustenance like a can of beans or an avocado and bacon sandwich. Once acquainted with the chaotic sets, the volatile temperament of actors and directors, and the general disorder of filmmaking, Hughes resolved to take an active role. His initial project, Swell Hogan, proved to be a costly misstep, draining $60,000 from his fortune. Despite pleas from his family and associates to abandon the film industry and preserve his wealth, Hughes remained undeterred. He promptly invested in the careers of actors and productions. The critics loved it, and profits from the film all that made up for his previous loss. At the age of 21, Hughes was a producer with a confirmed hit. As the spotlight shone on him, Hughes sought to relieve himself from the day-to-day business pressures by hiring Noah Dietrich as an advisor.
Dietrich came to work for him in the 1930s when, as dependent as Howard was on the tool company based in Houston, he felt he needed some liaison who would be able to look over the books and advise him as to how it was doing.
Noah took the business from that point, built it up to where at times it was earning between $50 and $55 million a year in those days.
Freed from these obligations, Hughes immersed himself in what truly fascinated him, the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. Establishing a film office, he secured the talents of director Louis Milestone under a 3-year contract. Their collaboration on 2 Arabian Nights catapulted then-unknown actors Louis Volheim and William Boyd to stardom, and earned Hughes his inaugural Academy Award in 1927. Unable to find a director who shared his passion for aviation, Hughes took matters into his own hands. He wrote, produced, and directed Hell's Angels, an epic depicting 2 British flyers vying for affections of an English socialite. Meanwhile, Hughes' own wife, Ella, reached her breaking point and filed for divorce, citing abandonment and cruelty. For the production of Hell's Angels, Hughes mobilized a considerable portion of Hollywood. He amassed a fleet of World War I fighter planes, hiring every available pilot in the industry. His obsession extended to cloud formations, often delaying expensive production schedules until the atmospheric conditions were perfect. Amidst these changes, Hughes, an accomplished pilot himself, impulsively took to the skies in a small scout plane he had never flown before. To the horror of the pilots and stuntmen, the plane went into a tailspin and crashed. Hughes emerged from the plane unscathed, prompting crew members to jest that at least he hadn't harmed his check-writing arm. Despite his narrow escape, Hughes feared better than others involved in the production, as 2 pilots tragically lost their lives during filming. By the time Hughes completed Hell's Angels, the public's fascination had shifted toward talkie pictures, leaving him disheartened. He envisioned his film as the pinnacle of cinematic epics, but realized its potential was limited without a synchronized soundtrack. Ignoring the advice of business advisors, Hughes commissioned a new script and embarked on reshooting dialogue scenes. Greta Nissen, with her thick Norwegian accent, lost her role, replaced by Harleen Carpenter, a bit player in Laurel and Hardy comedies, who Hughes transformed into Jean Harlow, the iconic platinum blonde bombshell.
Would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable?
After a staggering investment of $4 million, Hell's Angels premiered in grand fashion at Grauman's Chinese Theater.
You are looking at Hollywood Boulevard, illuminated for miles in honor of the opening of Hell's Angels. For the first time in history, Vine Street and Hollywood Boulevard have been made into one-way streets for 2 miles through the heart of Hollywood, to facilitate the handling of the traffic, bringing the throngs to this elaborate opening.
While the film shattered box office records, Hughes privately acknowledged that undertaking such a colossal project solo was one of his greatest misjudgments. But that didn't stop him from trying to cash in on the success of Hell's Angels. He released 2 quickly produced aviation pictures, Cock of the Air and Sky Devils. Both were complete failures. Another disappointment followed with Age for Love, nearing Hughes' tumultuous relationship with its leading lady, Billy Dove.
Howard was very much in love with Billy Dove, who, in silent pictures, was the most beautiful woman on the screen.
But they had a falling out, and I never forgot. Howard told me that he loaded all the furniture up there from Billy's house, took it in the middle of a desolate block, strangely enough, right on Wilshire Boulevard, and set fire to the whole damn thing. Burned up the van and furniture and all. Be amazing. Wouldn't be able to do that today anyway, I guess. But at that time, he did what he wanted.
Amidst the turmoil, newsreels across the nation sensationalized tales of infamous criminals like Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. Hughes, sensing the public's fascination with gangsters, seized upon the opportunity and selected Scarface as his next venture, loosely inspired by the life of Al Capone. Taking a more hands-off approach this time, Hughes entrusted Howard Hawks with the directional duties. Hawks cast Paul Mooney and George Raft in the lead roles. The film, characterized by its depiction of graphic violence, lust, rape, and subtle suggestions of incest, courted controversy. The self-censoring Hays office condemned the movie, demanding a new title and altered ending. Contrary to expectations, Hughes took a defiant stance and sued the Hays office, ultimately securing the right to exhibit Scarface in its original form.
He had a reputation for fighting the censors. Was he a great champion of First Amendment rights? And the answer to that is no. But he saw fighting the censors as a wonderful way to drum up mercantile interest in his movies.
While Hughes maintained his interest in filmmaking, he briefly retreated from the industry, redirecting his focus towards his beloved hobby of flying. Hughes and his Hollywood companions frequently graced the skies above Southern California.
Noah Dietrich used to say, you go flying around with Howard. He goes out there and he picks any airplane that's on the damn landing strip and takes off from it. And you're going to wind up getting killed. But Howard never got killed, nor did we.
With Hughes himself often disappearing for days, navigating his Boeing pursuit plane between California and Palm Springs. In 1934, Hughes showcased his aviation prowess by entering the Boeing in an air meet in Miami, effortlessly clinching victory with an impressive average speed of 185 miles an hour. This triumph ignited Hughes' passion for aviation, leading him to devote himself entirely to the field. Under the alias Charles Howard, Hughes worked as an assistant pilot for American Airlines, earning $250 a month while absorbing the intricacies of flight.
He loved to fly airplanes, loved everything about airplanes, loved the gauges in airplanes, loved to talk to pilots. The whole process, he was absorbed by it.
After just 2 months, Hughes departed from American Airlines and, alongside mechanic Glenn Oderkirk, established the Hughes Aircraft Company. Together, they embarked on the ambitious endeavor of crafting the world's fastest racer, the H-1.
That particular plane was one that he was instrumental in helping to design. But the heart of the way he designed airplanes was, he was a great brain picker. He would cull ideas from a whole range of things, weigh them, decide which ones might work, bounce them off other people. The H-1 was a perfect example of that. Outstanding, very swift, extremely modern-looking plane for its time.
On August 18, 1935, Hughes piloted the H-1 to set a remarkable land speed record of 352 miles an hour.
As ship is raised from runway and wings into the air, rafts are coming off craft that has long been called the Mystery Plane. And then the mystery unfolds as its owner, backer, builder, and pilot Howard Hughes brings the plane in from its test flight for a landing at the dangerous speed of 75 miles an hour. It's only 1935, yet millionaire sportsman Howard Hughes has flown over 300 miles an hour.
Capturing the public's imagination as a dashing aviator. In recognition of his extraordinary contributions to aviation, Hughes was awarded the prestigious Harmon Trophy in 1937. In a White House ceremony, President Roosevelt presented Hughes with the trophy, saying he hoped someday they could fly together. In 1938, Hughes embarked on what would become one of his most remarkable feats, a flight around the world.
If I've seemed to be in too much of a hurry to wait and pose for your pictures, it's not because I'm high-hat or anything like that, but just because I've been terribly worried that I wouldn't get out of here before the weather changed. I had a good break in the weather yesterday, and I've lost that, and I suppose it'll be fair today, but I've been in an awful rush to get away from here, and I hope you'll forgive me. Oh, you bet.
Amidst a crowd of onlookers, Hughes and a meticulously selected flight crew took off aboard their modified Lockheed 14, christened the New York World Fair. As a gesture of good fortune, Hughes dipped the wings over the home of his then-girlfriend, Katharine Hepburn, before embarking on a journey that would etch his name into aviation history.
Every conceivable kind of electronic gadget imaginable they packed onto that plane. The difference between that plane in 1938 and Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis across the water, just slightly more than 10 years before that as like night and day. I mean, the Lockheed that they flew around the world in was a very sophisticated airplane for its time that showed that interest of his in technology and was a great contribution towards seeing the kinds of long distances that planes could tackle.
The flight commenced with a record-breaking landing from New York to Paris in a mere 16 hours and 38 minutes, with Hughes at the helm.
I certainly hope that the fine friendship which now exists between America and France will continue and be an example to the other countries of the world.
With Hughes piloting, the flight path traversed from Paris to Moscow, down to Serbia, captivating the world's attention as they awaited updates on the crew's progress. However, amidst the acclaim, not all news was favorable. Departing Serbia, Hughes narrowly averted a disaster by narrowly missing a collision with a mountain range, misidentified on the U.S. survey map. Upon his return to New York, Hughes was hailed as a hero, having circumnavigated the globe in an astonishing 3 days, 19 hours, and 7 minutes.
I know you're tired. Congratulations. Welcome home. That will be tired through. Good luck. Is it true that you lost your antenna last night? What's the antenna?
Despite his reserved nature, Hughes endured 3 days of ticker-tape parades and receptions across New York, Chicago, Washington, and Houston. In 1940, Hughes redirected his aviation ventures towards a more pragmatic endeavor by acquiring a controlling stake in Transworld Airlines. His influence extended to conceptualizing the original design for the Lockheed Constellation.
He called us up one day and he said, I want to take a group to New York. It's the inaugural of the new plane that we've just done. It was named after my wife, Connie Moore. It was called the Constellation. So he said, will you put the group together at your house and then meet me at the Burbank Airport? And we're going to do it as a midnight flight. So I said, sure. Who do you want? I said, get every star in the business. But we had Paulette Goddard, and we had Lana Turner, Merrill Oberon, Cary Grant. Every star you could think of was in that thing. I never forgot that when I called Paulette Goddard, she said, tell Howard I'll do the trip, but I want 2 round-trip tickets to Rome. And I called Howard and I said, if you want Goddard, you got to give her 2 tickets to Rome. She says, oh, that bitch, give it to her. So she had 2 tickets to Rome. At any rate, as we got off plane in New York, and there was a blizzard, it was a blowing 60-mile-an-hour tailwind, so we flew there in a little over 5 hours, which was fantastic for a prop ship at that time.
While Hughes remained preoccupied with flying friends across the country, the escalating war in Europe prompted the Defense Department to enlist Hughes aircraft for the supply of aircraft components, artillery shells, and cannon barrels. Within the crowded Hughes aircraft hangar, work was also underway on an all-wood long-range bomber dubbed the D-2. By 1942, Allied ships were being decimated by German U-boats. To address the threat, President Roosevelt turned to Henry J. Kaiser, a businessman turned shipbuilder with a track record of success during wartime.
And because he'd been so successful at that, the plan he proposed as much as anybody and talked Hughes into it initially. Let's build these giant flying boats to ferry men and material across the seas. That's the way to get around the German U-boat menace. And Hughes always liked a challenge, so that sounds great.
In anticipation of securing a contract for flying boats, Hughes initiated testing of his amphibious Sikorsky S-43 on Nevada's Lake Mead. However, during one test, he was involved in a violent crash, making his 4th such incident. Despite Hughes escaping injury, tragically, 2 co-pilots lost their lives in the accident. Recognizing the importance of political connections, Hughes adeptly maneuvered within political circles. He directed his press agent, John Mayer, to host and entertain a group of visiting military officials, including President Roosevelt's influential son, Elliot, who played a role in military aircraft acquisition. Mayer facilitated tours of Hollywood and threw lavish parties, where aspiring starlets vied for attention of the esteemed guests. Those interactions, coupled with Hughes' influential Washington lobbyists, proved instrumental in securing an additional contract for 100 Hughes XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft, an extension for the earlier D-2 design. While Hughes was pleased with securing the contracts, the arduous task of designing and manufacturing the aircraft took a toll on him, leaving him mentally drained.
The flying boat is an astonishing achievement in some ways, but one of the most impractical things ever conceived. Building a plane of that size was an enormous undertaking to begin with, but building one out of wood, where you had to measure every particular piece for its density, versus a piece of metal where you know what that density will be, absolutely nightmarish kind of thing to undertake. And it helped as much as anything to push Hughes into his first major mental breakdown, which occurred in World War II, where he went off to the desert of Nevada for several months and just basically had to isolate himself from the calls, from the pressure, from the decisions that went into building that particular. It's also one of the reasons it was not finished before the war was over.
Although World War II had ended, Hughes continued production on the flying boat and personally financed the completion of his XF-11. Many of Hughes' Hollywood friends looked on as he piloted the prototype XF-11. As in the past, Hughes insisted on personally testing his aircraft. The flight ended in tragedy as his plane lost a propeller and careened towards a residential section of Beverly Hills.
He could have saved himself. All he had to do was parachute out. But something went wrong with the plane, and he kind of fought with the plane trying to find out what was wrong with it. And then boom, all of a sudden it hit.
We were going to visit Dennis O'Keefe, who lived on the street about 2 blocks away from the country club. And as we got to Dennis's house, he said, "Christ, Howard's plane just took the top of our roof off our house and landed up in the country club, crashed." And I couldn't believe it. I drove over there, but Howard had been taken away already. He was really banged up.
Hughes was swiftly rushed to a Beverly Hills emergency room, where doctors delivered a grim diagnosis. He was in shock, suffering from severe burns, broken bones, and extensive internal injuries, including a crushed torso that displaced his heart to one side of his chest cavity.
It's not entirely clear exactly how it affected him physically from then on out, but it has always been assumed that some of his attachment to codeine, which turned out to be a lifelong addiction, stemmed from that time.
Despite the severity of his injuries, Hughes miraculously survived and displayed promising signs of recovery during his hospitalization.
While he was in the hospital and he began to feel better, they didn't have automatic beds. Howard designed the automatic bed in the hospital where you can raise the feet or the head or the middle of it. Whatever the hell you want to do, the controls are at the beds, and all the hospitals have those beds now, and Howard designed that bed.
Exactly 1 year after the harrowing crash, fully recuperated, Hughes bravely took to the skies again in the rebuilt XF-11. However, the government's response was less than enthusiastic, as it announced an investigation into Hughes' activity as a defense contractor.
Mr. Hughes, the papers say that you're going back to Washington. Is that correct? Yes, I'm going there to testify before Senator Brewster's War Investigating Committee. As you know, the committee has caused quite a stir by its investigation of my 2 airplane projects, the XF-11 photographic plane and my large flying boat.
$40 million has been paid by the government to the Hughes Aviation Company, and nothing has been thus far received. What became of the $40 million is what we want to know.
So I ask you this question again, Senator Brewster. During my last trip to Washington, and while we were having lunch in your suite at the Mayflower Hotel, did you or did you not offer to call off this entire investigation if I would agree
to merge TWA Trans World Airline with your friend Juan Tripp's Pan American Airways.
The hearings commenced on July 28, 1947, in the caucus room of the Senate Office Building, with Hughes' press agent, John Mayer, taking the stand first. Mayer faced questioning regarding Hughes' alleged preferential treatment of government officials, including the extravagant expenditure of $5,000 on alcohol, food, and entertainment for Elliott Roosevelt and his associates.
Girls were very pleasant.
What has that got to do with aircraft production?
It just went along. Every company in the business did it. We're no different.
Well, but is it? You say because she was very charming, that's the reason that you charged up $132.
That's right.
For which would go into the production of airplanes.
Right.
And now, will you tell us why you gave her $20 and charged it up to the company to go home if she was very charming?
What? You taught me. Listen. Very good. Point one.
Hughes himself was the final witness to testify, displaying evident disdain for his accusers throughout the proceedings.
Now, will you give me the questions in advance that you want to ask me while I am here? Or will you give them to any third neutral party? Is it not true that you are going to propound the questions for me as I testify and based upon what I testify as I go along? Are you willing to set aside the questions in advance which you will ask me?
Mr. Hughes.
When John Mayer failed to appear on August 8th, the committee became enraged.
Now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now about a reply that I made. My answer is I don't remember. Now, the man is taking it down there. Let's ask him. What?
Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
Oh, I don't think I'll try.
All right.
Throughout the hearings, Hughes stood his ground, but the final straw came when questioning turned to the flying boat project.
I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Overall, the committee had made a disastrous misjudgment. They sought to prove that Hughes had profited from his wartime contract, when in reality, he had poured millions of his own dollars into the project. During a recess in the hearings, Hughes orchestrated the monumental task of relocating large sections of the flying boat from Culver City to Long Beach Harbor, incurring a significant cost of $50,000. Technical crews labored tirelessly, assembling the components day and night, while speculations ran rife in newspapers that Hughes might attempt to fly the craft before the hearings resumed. Demonstrating a stroke of public relations brilliance, Hughes orchestrated an event where newsreel cameras captured him leading senators on an inspection of the flying boat.
I think the United States owes a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Howard Hughes for conceiving and for constructing this great plane. It's one of the most valuable contributions to aeronautical science, I believe, which has ever been made, and will be of inestimable value, not only to aviation, but I believe eventually to the country's security.
On November 2nd, 1947, amidst a crowd of thousands of spectators, Hughes confidently taxied the 60-ton craft into Long Beach Harbor.
The Air Giant starts to move, driven by her 8 3,000-horsepower motors. And now for Mr. Hughes' surprise. As the enormous craft approaches her 95-mile-an-hour takeoff speed, the pilot lifts her out of the step and holds her there as she races through the choppy sea. And with the final drive of her engines, 200 tons are airborne, 5 months ahead of time. 70 feet off the water, she stays for a mile. $23 million worth of airplane has answered a lot of committee questions. It can fly.
His triumphant display showcased the merit of his prized flying boat and effectively brought the Brewster hearings to a swift conclusion.
when Senator Brewster realized that he was fighting a battle against public opinion, a losing battle, he folded up and took a run-out powder. Yes, that was the tip-off. When Senator Brewster hit the road for the backwoods of Maine, that meant the hearing was over. Washington was too hot for him. He couldn't take it. After that, the other senators in this committee saw no reason why they should fight Brewster's losing battle for him if he was too cowardly to remain and face the music.
I saw what Hughes did to Brewster during the hearing, and he helped choose a candidate to run against Brewster, gave financial assistance, and he defeated Brewster. And the last time I saw Owen Brewster, he was in the halls of the Senate begging for a $10,000 a year job, which he could not get.
Back in Hollywood, Hughes carefully crafted his image as a Hollywood playboy. As one starlet astutely observed, Hughes could have had any physical imperfection, but his wealth made him irresistible.
Along with the notion that he made a lot of money, that he had a Midas touch, that he was an aviation genius, that he was a financial whiz, that he was a great movie maker. He also liked to add to that list of superlatives the fact he was a great ladies' man.
Hollywood gossip columns frequently featured Hughes, linking him romantically to numerous glamorous starlets.
He was a bachelor, very much available, and he courted every girl in the whole damn town.
At one time, I'm sure he is dated, which is a kind of a kind word for it, all the girls on the 20th Century Fox contract list. Yeah, Howard, he had them gone, boy.
Howard was never a wallflower, but he didn't mingle too much either.
Yes, he was very shy around women, but he had more women than anyone. I think he had more women than Errol Flynn.
And of course, he had no trouble having dates because everyone knew who he was and everyone liked him. He used to love to go out and he'd dance. He was a good dancer. He was a good rhythm.
That guy could jitterbug, Latin dance, anything. He was fantastic. I was at the Coconut Grove one night with Howard Hughes and Marilyn Monroe. I saw him and Marilyn out there jitterbugging like crazy. Marilyn and I were drinking Dom Perignon. Howard was drinking Poland water.
What he did do with a lot of the girls, including Ginger Rogers, he'd have a whole tray of jewelry, and I mean jewelry, beautiful necklaces and brooches and rings. And Mrs. Ginger turned him down. She wouldn't have any part of it because she was his girl for a while. And Catherine Grayson took it. She had that whole tray of jewelry, as I remember.
In fact, he offered Elizabeth Taylor $1 million tax-free if she would marry him. But Elizabeth, who was very young at the time, I think she's still in her teens, she turned him down. Very unromantic proposal.
Unfortunately, I saw one trait in Howard that I never liked, and I liked this man very much. But he always told every girl he ever went with that he was going to marry her. Why the hell he said that, I don't know.
He was going with Lana Turner, and Lana madly in love with him. And she thought sure she was going to marry him. She went and had all the towels and bed linens monogrammed H.H. When Howard found out about it, he says, "Why don't you marry Huntington Hartford?" He was very much in love with Linda Darnell, and she was gorgeous. But she told me they don't call it Hughes Tool Company for nothing.
Howard Hughes again turned a hobby into an industry when he purchased RKO Studios in May of 1948.
If he wanted to spend $22 million to buy RKO, whether RKO was a success or not didn't make much difference because the following year, Hughes Tool would spit out another 50 or 55 million.
That was the company that year in and year out churned out the profits and made it possible for him to invest in all of these other things.
Even though he bought the studio and put some good people in there running it, he never saw the studio.
There used to be a legend that Howard Hughes went in the studio one night at midnight and said, "Paint it." Howard told me that wasn't true. He said, the closest he ever got to RKO studio, he drove down Gower Street, and he turned to the Nate and says, "That studio needs a paint job." And the thing was painted the next day.
He used to office in a little one-room office at Golden Studio. He'd have a desk and 2 wooden chairs. But he was just exactly across the aisle from a projection room. And there he would sit every night and see the rushes that were done all day long of all the various pictures at RKO. And he would sit there and pick out the scenes that he wanted put in or scenes he wanted cut.
The painting that I did, he just enjoyed very, very much. I think only once did he say to me, would you lower the décolletage a little bit, about a half-inch here, and move it down to about a 1/4 of an inch here, but never made any other comment than that. One evening, he spent a half hour on the couch with me in Beverly Hills just discussing the thickness of a shirt. Now, obviously, the thickness of the shirt had to do with a garment that was, in this particular case, on Jane Russell. And he wanted me to understand very clearly how the thickness of the shirt would appear as it was against human flesh. But he was painstaking to make certain that I understood not the thickness of a pocket, not the thick. He would repeat it over and over again, and then would always ask, "You understand what I mean?" I would say, "Yes, Mr. Hughes, I do." And then he would go over it again, and when you left, it was impressed in your mind exactly what he had in mind to do.
Although Howard Hughes was now a powerful studio owner, he certainly didn't play the part.
He phoned me actually at the office possibly once during the years we were together. He liked to phone people about 3 o'clock in the morning. The reason for that is this. Mr. Hughes believed in something called natural sleep. And what did that mean? That meant that one kept awake until one grew tired. When one grew tired, one went to sleep. This could be 36 hours, it could be 3. It could be on the floor of his office, it could be in his bed. It didn't matter terribly. He liked the nights because it was very quiet. There was another reason for his liking the nights. He was growing hard of hearing, and the nights obviously a little more quiet than the daylight. He used to call me about 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, and the conversation usually began very politely as follows. "Sorry to disturb you, Bill." And I say, "I'm sorry also, Howard," my voice being thick with sleep. And he'd say, "You sure you're all right? It doesn't bother you?" And I said, thinking my contract, "Not a bit, not a bit." And then he would tell me a particular project that we would discuss, often on the phone for 20, 30 minutes. Always polite, always well-mannered, and always ended again with an apology for disturbing me.
Howard, when he'd work maybe 48 to 60 hours at a time, and then conk out. And he'd sometimes sleep in his car. He had the cheapest car you could buy. When I used to ride around with him, he had a Chevy, a stick shift, no radio. And I was driving with him once, and I says, "Howard, with all your money, why in the hell don't you get a Rolls Royce?" And he says, "Who do I have to impress?"
And he never had a dime in his pocket, never had any money.
He'd always borrowed money. He never had any money on him. He never thought about money. It just came in, you know.
I guess that Hughes Tool Company must have just given him millions to play with.
In the mid-1950s, Las Vegas, Nevada became Howard Hughes's favorite playground. He frequented floor shows and enjoyed the company of glamorous showgirls, albeit only after securing signed contracts of silence.
He moved to Las Vegas long before he bought hotels there, because he'd work 48 hours at a time, and then he'd go out and walk around the town. No one recognized him. And he liked it. You know, Las Vegas is a great place to be anonymous.
It was in Las Vegas that Hughes purchased one of the few houses he ever owned, affectionately named the Greenhouse.
He lived here in the 50s, the very early 50s. And, of course, it was about that time that he started to turn into this tremendous recluse. And he never returned here after he left here in 1955, I believe he left. At the time that he left it, there is a large area that had monstrous, or actually hotel size, air conditioners, humidifiers, because, like I say, he did have this horrible fear of germs. So the house was just literally a time capsule. Clothes were still in the closets, linens, beds were still made, just like he was planning to come back. This room that we're in right now, and is now the dining room, was actually his living room, and it was very sparsely furnished, and I would say in a I call it early motel or desperate American. It was very utilitarian, nothing pretty about it. This room was his viewing room. He watched movies constantly. He slept mostly during the day. And you'll notice on the windows, the heavy, heavy screening. There were a massive amount of phones when we originally came in here, approximately 50. All of them, of course, had hearing aids, boosters on them, because he was very hard of hearing.
This secluded retreat featured a small office area equipped with a memo recorder and an Edison voice writer, providing Hughes with a link to his business empire. Meanwhile, RKO Studios, under Hughes' control, experienced a significant decline, accruing losses exceeding $8 million in its initial years. Hughes, known for his staunch anti-communist stance, initiated mass layoffs at RKO, suspecting many employees of communist sympathies, including studio head Dore Schary.
I got a call from Howard one night, and Howard said, I've got to get rid of Dore Schary. Well, he's a communistic bastard, and I want him the hell out of the studio.
His anti-communist fervor was so intense that he even delivered a rare speech denouncing communism at the Hollywood American Legion Post. At his tenure at RKO, Hughes adopted the unusual practice of enticing hundreds of aspiring starlets to Hollywood with promises of fame and fortune.
That's another thing I didn't like about him. If you'd see a picture of a beautiful girl who would want to Miss America or something, he'd bring her here, do a test with her in the studio, stash her in a bungalow, and she could stay there for 10 years and the bungalows were paid for.
Sometimes he'd have 20 of them on his list, set them up in apartments and give them cars to drive.
But she might never ever go back to the studio again. If they did have something, he'd give them a chance, but most of the girls were not very artistically inclined. I guess they were just beautiful girls.
They'd wait by the phone for Howard to call, and he might call once a month,
After all, if he'd hear that somebody had, for instance, Terry Moore was let go at Columbia, and Howard said, let's bring Terry Moore in. So I signed her up at the studio. It's interesting that later on, Terry came to the executives of the estate and said that she had secretly married him on the yacht.
Terry was a strict Mormon and very religious. And when she was going with Hughes, she was one of 3 Hollywood virgins in town. Terry told me, she says, I will not go to bed with Howard Hughes unless I'm married to him. She told him that to his face. So Howard, had to skip her this yacht, marry him, and then he threw the log overboard. No record of it. But I'm sure it happened, because Howard would do anything to get Terry in bed.
On December 17, 1953, Hughes established the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, although the true motivations behind this move remain a subject of debate.
He solved all of his problems by creating this tax-exempt charitable organization. And the really interesting part, of course, is that the taxpayers pick up the bill for it, because in its first or second or third years of existence, the Medical Institute, about 84% of its revenue it returns to Howard Hughes, and it spends about 1% of its revenue on actual medical research. And you go through the years, it gets something like $2 million from Hughes Aircraft Company. And in the same period of time, it pays something like $22 or $23 million to Howard Hughes as interest payments and lease payments. And so it was really the ultimate charity.
By 1955, Hughes had amassed a remarkable empire, spanning various industries and endeavors. Of special note was Hughes Aircraft, a company which was doing groundbreaking research in electronics and pioneering high-tech electronic weaponry. At his office on 7000 Romaine Street, Hughes began systematically isolating himself from business contacts through a division called Operations. This peculiar organization was masterminded by assistant Bill Gay, a devout Mormon who recruited fellow church members to serve as operators, drivers, and personal aides to Hughes.
He had one particular section of it, which was in effect like a control panel, almost like a dispatcher's desk. You think of it as in a police department. Somebody manned it 24 hours a day, receiving calls from various parts of the empire.
And these were attorneys, as well as people with the Hughes Tool Company, vice presidents, presidents, and airline people, and on and on and on. So that would consume hours just to get everybody notified of what was going on.
This was a device by remote control that enabled him to keep various parts of his empire in check and to respond to their demands when he wanted without having to directly confront a particular need.
Despite his efforts to insulate himself from certain decisions, Hughes found himself unable to evade the repercussions of purchasing a new fleet of jets for TWA. The complex selection and financing process pushed Hughes to the brink of mental collapse. In a surprising move, Hughes parted ways with Noah Dietrich, his closest advisor of 32 years. That same year, he married longtime acquaintance Gene Peters.
There are all kinds of theories at the time that he was possibly going to be committed for some mental problems, which is one of the reasons supposedly Noah Dietrich fell out of favor. By being married, could only get the cooperation of a wife to assist in that process.
And I remember, never forget one night, she was walking out of the hotel, and I said, "Hello, Jean, how are you?" And she turned to me and she says, "Have you seen Howard lately?" I thought it was very strange, because now she was married to him at the time.
From then on, you also see a gradual mental decline in terms of those problems in his personality, fear of germs, phobias about disease and illness, an increasing desire to isolate himself from other human beings.
I found him in the garden of the Beverly Hills Hotel, wandering around, all alone, dressed. And I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I just came here to look around." I said, "Come in and have a drink with him." He said, "No, I'm going to pass, Johnny." And that's the last time I saw Howard.
Under mounting pressure from the TWA decision, Hughes sought solace by retreating to the Bahamas, where he isolated himself in a darkened hotel suite. During this time, he planned substantial real estate investments, enlisting the help of former CIA operative Bob Mayhew. Mayhew had previously freelanced for Hughes, primarily conducting surveillance on ex-girlfriends and recruiting aspiring starlets. Before departing the Bahamas, Hughes contracted Mayhew and entrusted him with a more significant role in managing his empire.
He explained to me that he did not want to make any public appearances in the future, that he wanted me to become his alter ego. He wanted me to convince the world that when they spoke to me, they in reality were speaking to Howard Hughes.
After 6 months of exile from the TWA ordeal, Hughes returned to Los Angeles and took up residence in the Beverly Hills Hotel. There, he began orchestrating a peculiar world within his rented bungalow. Although his room was cluttered with debris, he declared it a germ-free zone, and his staff of personal aides followed very precise methods while attending to Hughes.
For example, if you're going to open a can of food, you have to cover your hands with tissue paper when you take the can opener to open. The bowl that the food goes into must be cleaned vigorously before that happens. When you open a car door for him to get into, you must hold the tissues over the car door.
His Romaine Street staff prepared a thick procedures manual for those working closely with Hughes.
Step number 3, washing of can. He should first soak and remove the label, and then brush the cylindrical part of the can over and over until all particles of dust, pieces of paper, and in general, all sources of contamination have been removed.
He wanted the drapes closed so people couldn't look in from outside. And at that particular time, he had me instruct the people to dip rags and alcohol and wipe all the doorknobs, so there'd be no germs on all the doorknobs.
And they had to be sanitized, so to speak. In other words, the windows had to be closed, they had to be scotch taped down and so on, etc., etc.
He wouldn't shake hands with people and didn't want people touching him.
I think we bought up all the cosmetic gloves in Beverly Hills. I don't see how they could make any more movies till they ordered some more cosmetic gloves. You're supposed to keep them on all the time. Little white gloves.
It is equally important to me that nobody ever opens any door or opening to any room, cabinet, or closet, or anything used to store any of my things, even for 1,000th of an inch, for 1,000th of a second. I don't want the possibility of dust or insects or anything of that nature entering.
Open the door as little as you can and get in before the bugs and everything gets in, and then close it again quickly. That's all.
Hughes rarely bathed and went naked with increasing frequency. He spent a great deal of his time cleaning anything within reach with his endless supply of Kleenex. He stopped screening films at the studio and instead had them delivered to the bungalow. His drug use had increased, and a constant stream of messengers hand-delivered bottles of codeine to the Hughes staff. When lonely, he would often call for an aide to sit silently in the bungalow.
Well, he was sitting at his table over on there, and there's 2 other chairs in the room, and he, for some reason, just said, "Chuck, that's your chair." So every time I went in there, I would sit in that same goddamn chair. And we didn't talk to him. He talked to you. He said, "Chuck, yeah, what time is it?" So we were there at different hours back and forth. So I would get up to go over and show him my watch. And then I'd start to say, "It's 3:30, Mr. Hughes." "Shh, don't say a thing." You didn't tell him what it was. You put your watch in front of him and let him decide what time it was.
Howard Hughes built his own prison, and he made sure that you couldn't escape from it. He did it himself. I mean, he just had these aides surround him, and if you needed to talk to Hughes, you didn't talk to him.
And what's sad is that most of those around him at the time were completely catering to this phobia. There wasn't one person around him who said, "Howard, this is crazy, this is silly, these things aren't going to bother you." I mean, they treated this seriously, like this was a matter of national security.
When his fear of germs subsided, Hughes was able to lapse into periods of clear thought. During one of these secluded periods, Hughes successfully negotiated financing for the fleet of TWA jets.
The way he worked out the financing was not acceptable in some ways to the TWA president and the executives of TWA.
Suit was filed against Hughes for mismanagement.
It wasn't too long after that when Hughes, for various reasons, sold all of his TWA stock at a figure which was about 86 per share, almost higher than it had ever been.
Well, the check was for $546,549,771 and no cents.
Which I believe was probably the largest business check ever written in the United States.
That was a fair piece of change. Yes, a fair piece of change.
Advised to leave California to avoid hefty taxes on his newfound windfall, Hughes made an uncharacteristic move by traveling by train, first to Boston and then onward to Las Vegas. Under the guidance of Bob Mayhew, Hughes was discreetly ushered into the Desert Inn through a service entrance, where he and his aides settled into suites on the penthouse floor. Hughes would remain in near constant isolation there for the next 4 years. His prolonged stay eventually led to tensions with the Desert Inn's owners, who sought to reclaim control of their lucrative high roller suites.
Came a time later where they had given an instruction to the security guards that if Hughes was not vacated in 48 hours, that they would bodily come up to the 9th floor and kick him out of the hotel.
They were very unhappy when Hughes didn't want to leave, so it ended up that we started negotiations and finally made the deal in March to acquire the hotel.
Now, in other words, he bought the hotel because he needed a place to sleep.
However, during negotiations, Hughes' tax attorney presented a solution. Casino receipts could be classified as active income, resolving his tax predicament.
He was in ecstasy. He called me and he said, imagine, this is money from heaven. Are there any more of these joints available?
And so after that, we started to buy more hotels. He got excited about it and had all this cash laying around, so to speak.
About that time, he made up his mind that he wanted to be the biggest in the gaming business.
Empowered by this revelation, Hughes embarked on a spending spree, acquiring ownership of the Desert Inn, Sands, Castaways, Frontier, Silver Slipper, and Landmark casinos.
Well, Las Vegas at that time had that image of being the center of organized crime, that organized crime was very deeply involved in it.
And Mr. Hughes came in and purchased those casinos that the state felt they were having trouble with, and he was very welcome in that regard.
He shifted the emphasis, the public emphasis from Las Vegas, the organized crime people, to Las Vegas, the billionaire industrialist.
The state of Nevada granted exceptions for its most renowned citizen.
Historically, everyone who asks for a Nevada gambling license has to personally appear before the Gaming Control Board or Gaming Commission.
And in each case, he refused to make an appearance. He refused to furnish fingerprints, contemporary photos, or financials.
Now, that was one of my responsibilities as well, incidentally, to convince the state gaming licensing authorities not to require his personal appearance. So they adopted what they call the Hughes Rule.
Hughes was not content with being the biggest in the gaming industry. He also sought to influence governments citywide and statewide.
Mr. Hughes wanted to have a summary of every bill introduced in the Nevada legislature, and he wanted me to pass on his comments to the legislator, which I did. He had an insatiable appetite to want his views to be known and be accepted as far as certain legislation was concerned. He's a very bright human being. Most of the things he requested me to do, and Mr. Mayhew to do, not all of them, but most of them, were good recommendations. Some of them we couldn't carry out.
From his penthouse perch, Hughes issued a challenging request: halt the construction of the International Hotel. His rationale? Hughes believed that owner Kirk Kerkorian was stealing his spotlight.
It was almost funny. I mean, when he gave me the assignment to try to dissuade Kerkorian from building the big International, I could not succeed because Kirk had made up his mind that that's what he was going to do.
And we said, okay, we'll go ahead, but we really couldn't do it, and we really didn't try, because it was an embarrassing situation to try and stop another hotel from being built.
He had me talk to Kirk on on many instances, trying to discourage him because of the underground testing, that although high-rise hotels would collapse, and Kirk just went about his business. And although he was always very friendly to Mr. Hughes, but he didn't pay a damn bit of attention to what we had to say.
Showcasing his irrational thought process and its detrimental impact to his own hotel's profitability.
The Tournament of Champions was at the Desert Inn. It was a regular annual golf tournament that brought in the best pros and a lot of stars and a lot of tourists, and Hughes canceled the Tournament of Champions.
And to think that you would take this kind of an asset and just say, we'll turn it over gratis to someone else if they'll take us off the hook, was incomprehensible to me. Yes, it bothered me. And of course, the fact that his reason was that it would create too many germs bothered me even more.
Obsessed with control, Hughes seemed to envision dominion over the entirety of Nevada. From his darkened penthouse, he meticulously charted maps outlining his latest acquisitions, including vast stretches of underdeveloped land, the North Las Vegas airport, numerous mining claims, and a television station acquired not only for investment, but also for his personal amusement.
He wanted to watch the movies that he wanted to watch on television. He was watching a lot of television. And so I think maybe that was the motivation for buying that station.
Howard Hughes would watch the movies all night long, and as a general rule, he would have an aide call the next day complaining about the movie that ran last night. And this was almost an everyday occurrence. It would happen a lot.
He was the one that decided what movies were going to be shown, what was available, and get this movie from California. And so it ended up that whatever movie was scheduled, if he didn't want to run that, he'd say, I want to see this.
While Hughes whiled away the hours watching films broadcast by his TV station, Bob Mayhew assumed an increasingly influential role within the Hughes empire. Despite never having met Hughes, Mayhew held the title of head of Hughes Nevada's operations.
And consequently, we began using the Romaine Street office in Hollywood less and less.
He very strongly told me, upon his arrival in Las Vegas, that not only did he want a complete severance from the group at 7000 Romaine, which was Bill Gay and his associates, but he didn't want any of them to even come to Las Vegas.
And there was a power play going on between Bill Gay, Chester Davis, and Bob Mayhew. They were getting shunted farther aside, and Mayhew was coming up in the ranks.
Bill Gay, Frank William Gay, real name, but everybody called him Bill. Bill formulated his power, if that's the correct word, power. He formulated his authority in that he controlled the aides who surrounded Howard Hughes.
The aides really became his family. And they supplied his food. They gave him the drugs he took every day, whether it was the Valium or codeine or whatever. They were his whole life support system.
Nobody had direct access to Hughes. The aides had direct access to Hughes, and Bill Gay had direct access to the aides. So if you wanted to talk to Hughes, you had to talk to Bill, and Bill in turn had to talk to the aides.
Unaware of the internal machinations within his empire, Hughes remained fixated on television. It was while engrossed in a program that Hughes stumbled upon news of a new round of atomic testing planned for Nevada, sending him into a state of paralyzing fear. He knew that unlike the germs that he fought to shield himself from, radiation could not be prevented from entering his carefully guarded environment. He declared war on the Atomic Energy Commission and pledged unlimited resources in stopping the tests.
That's one of the reasons he established that power in Nevada. He was, trying to pull a lot of political strings to get that atomic testing stopped.
I recall a particular test called, it was codenamed Boxcar. And it was a large underground nuclear test. I think they were figuring it was about equal to about 1 million tons of TNT, megaton. And Hughes absolutely wanted that thing stopped.
He bent every effort humanly possible to stop the tests in Nevada at the test site. But we were unsuccessful in that regard. And we had to stop pushing too hard because it was becoming embarrassing.
I remember numerous briefings with the Department of Energy prior to the Boxcar detonation. And I know that the reason that occurred was on the other side of the street. The Hughes people are saying, you can't do this, you've got to stop this.
These were genuine concerns, and he wrote memo after memo on these subjects in trying to get the test stopped.
I say Nevada is no longer so desperate for mere existence that it has to accept and swallow with a smile poisonous, contaminated radioactive waste material more horrible than human excrement.
Unable to prevent the Boxcar test, Hughes intensified his efforts to influence the upcoming presidential election, seeking support from any candidate who would succeed outgoing President Lyndon Johnson.
To put all this in true perspective, what happened is that Hughes made a decision on the same day, wrote me a memo telling me that he wanted me to see Richard Nixon as soon as possible and offer him unlimited help with his campaign, because it was very important that he, Richard Nixon, be the next president of the United States. The same day, he sent me another memo saying to go see Hubert Humphrey and offer him unlimited support because it was very important that he be the next president of the United States.
Despite this, he also attempted a last-ditch effort to appeal to President Johnson himself.
Well, on 2 occasions, he wanted me to offer $1 million to then presidents to try to stop the underground testing. And by that time, I had reached a point in my world with him where I knew that I had to give him the impression that I was doing it for fear that he'd give the assignment to someone who'd be stupid enough to try.
By 1970, Hughes' health was visibly deteriorating. Logs maintained his aides revealed his increasing reliance on narcotics, including both oral and injectable forms of codeine, as well as massive doses of Valium, which Hughes referred to as blue bombers. This drug dependency led to chronic constipation, necessitating frequent enemas. Hughes even insisted on preserving his urine in jars stored in the closet of his penthouse. With his health failing, Hughes slept more and ate less. His kidneys suffered from the effects of his 2-decade-long addiction to codeine. Meanwhile, his marriage to Jean Peters had deteriorated to the point where she had not seen him in over 3.5 years, prompting her to file for divorce. In the midst of these personal struggles, another battle emerged between Bob Mayhew and Hughes' personal aides, who were tightening their grip on Hughes' affairs.
I began to get the impression that some of my memos were not getting through to him.
That's probably where Mayhew may have misjudged, is that they still controlled the flow of information. And that was the ultimate test. They determined, what information got to Hughes and whether Mayhew's information got to Hughes. And that was very critical, absolutely.
Communications shut down. Nobody could communicate. I had some very important things I had to communicate through Mayhew, through Bob Mayhew, and Mayhew had no communication with him. They just shut us down. And you obviously sensed something wrong in that situation.
I think Mayhew was an empire builder, and I think he enjoyed the power and the position that he had in representing Hughes's interests. But I think he allocated to himself certain powers and privileges that were a little excessive.
I think jealousy, envy, and the fact that it looked like Mayhew was building his own empire within the Hughes empire that caused the demise of Bob Mayhew.
There's no doubt in my mind that they convinced him that I, in fact, had stolen money from him. And it breaks my heart to think that Howard Hughes died without knowing the difference.
On November 13th, 1970, a proxy came over the telecopier in the Desert Inn penthouse. It finalized an action that had been in the planning stages for months. Upon obtaining Hughes' signature, the proxy effectively transferred control of Hughes Nevada Holdings to executive Bill Gay and Chester Davis, a TWA attorney closely associated with the Hughes. On November 25th, 1970, the Desert Inn penthouse was empty.
They took this man out of here Thanksgiving Eve. It was a very cold night, when his doctor had told me 2 days earlier that he was so sick that he would not move him from the Desert Inn to Sunrise Hospital, which is not a mile away, unless it were a dire emergency.
Well, he clearly was not in good physical shape when he left the Desert Inn. I mean, you were looking at someone who was consuming large quantities of Valium, codeine, other drugs.
Interestingly, it was later revealed that despite Hughes's critical illness, the quantities of codeine and Valium made available to him, and apparently consumed by him in the weeks leading up to the proxy's acquisition, reached some of the highest levels in his life.
They took this man on this night, waltzed him down 9 flights of exterior fire escape, and brought him to Nellis Airport and flew him to the Bahamas.
The contact that law enforcement and that media and that the public had as far as Hughes, was Bob Mayhew. And Bob Mayhew sincerely believed that Hughes was forced to leave here against his will.
But there was some confusion as to who was a leader, who was in power, who should the political people listen to.
I began getting calls from the casino managers saying the people were moving into the cages. I called the governor. I said, has this been cleared with you? No. I called the Gaming Control Board. Has this been cleared with you? No. Called the Gaming Commission? No.
Mayhew was saying, I'm in charge. Holliday, Davis, and Gay were saying, no, we're in charge. And it was like a war. It was going on. One camp was headquartered at the Sands. Another camp was headquartered at the Frontier.
That confusion lasted for several months until it finally, the papers were sent in, powers of attorney were sent in to the government officials, placing Chester Davis and others in charge. So that was sufficient for them to feel comfortable that Mayhew was out and the new people were in.
I was sick. But then I realized that the battle was over. I realized that somehow, whatever they had done, they had convinced him that I was on the wrong side of the fence.
In early December, Hughes retreated to a penthouse at the Britannia Beach Hotel on Paradise Island, seeking respite from the troubles that plagued him in Las Vegas. Little did he know that a man he had never met would soon become a significant problem, Clifford Irving. Irving, an author with 8 books to his name, including the popular Fake, which centered on art forgeries, embarked on a far more audacious scheme in 1971. He claimed to be collaborating with Hughes on an autobiography and forged letters purportedly written by Hughes to substantiate his claim. Convinced by the forged documents, the McGraw-Hill Publishing Company advanced Irving $100,000 for the publishing rights. Despite denials of authenticity from the Hughes Tool Company, there was no feasible way to bring Hughes out of isolation to refute the claims. Irving seemingly crafted the perfect scam, for no one had so much as seen Hughes for over a decade, and many questioned his very existence.
Then it got to be of concern to, I don't know whether it was probably government officials as well as the public. Does Howard Hughes exist? Is he alive?
There was a very serious thought in the public and among many people who were in areas of authority that thought he was probably dead. And these people were merely speaking for him.
In an attempt to placate nervous Nevada gaming officials, Hughes placed a call to former Governor Paul Laxalt. Hughes' mental condition at the time seems questionable, given the memo that was passed to him before the call was placed.
Your conversation should be exactly as the script was outlined to you. Make it most emphatic, with no discussion as to why, just a confirmation. However, it would be a good idea to mention your loss of confidence in Mayhew. And you could end by emphasizing your intention to return to Las Vegas after your business trip.
One of them said to me, they said, wait a minute, he talked on the phone to your predecessor, and, he was satisfied. Well, I said, I'm not my predecessor. I like my predecessor, Paul Laxalt, but I can't tell on the phone whether this is Howard Hughes or not.
In an effort to dispel confusion surrounding the Clifford Irving hoax, it was arranged for Hughes to address a group of reporters via telephone, a group who had known him before his reclusive years.
Hughes called me up from the Britannia Beach Hotel in the Bahamas the day before, and he says, I'm going to come out and expose Clifford Irving, a big hoax. And he said, I'm going to have a press conference, which I'll talk on phone. He says, I want you on it. We assembled in this room, and all the other reporters, asked all kinds of trick questions. Make sure it was Howard Hughes and not Richard Little. And, of course, when it came my turn, I said, I know that voice anywhere. He said, I've heard it too many times. It's etched in my memory.
When questioned about Clifford Irving, Hughes simply responded with, I don't know him. However, reporters took the opportunity to probe further, delving into more personal matters.
Someone asked him about his report that he had fingernails 10 inches long. And, he laughed about it. He says, how in the hell could I write my name?
And all the correspondents chuckle at it as well, like these stories are exaggerated. But the stories weren't exaggerated. He was just that loony at the time. But what is intriguing about him is that he knew the outside world would frown on him if they knew he was that way.
And I, at that time, made a remark that as far as I was concerned, there's nothing but a big circus. They said, oh yeah, that's his voice. Well, you know, what's the big deal? Why don't we just see this voice? If everything is fine? And so we had some doubts on whether or not he was really in control of his company.
Over the next 7 months, Hughes and his aides embarked on a global journey to evade corporate lawsuits and the relentless pursuit of photographers aiming to capture a glimpse of the elusive billionaire. At each destination, Hughes retreated to the familiar sanctuary of a darkened hotel suite. Constantly medicated, Hughes spent most of his waking hours engrossed in films projected on a screen at the foot of his bed. Unaware of the ongoing TWA lawsuit, he was in no state to engage in the fight, even as executives urged him to sell his namesake, the Hughes Tool Division.
TWA ultimately sued Hughes and was awarded a substantial judgment. And Hughes Tool Company, which had provided all the money through the years to fund all of Howard's various enterprises, from the filmmaking to the airplanes to everything, Howard gets enormous pressure to sell it. And this is at a time when he's really totally isolated, under the control of the people who are around him every day.
But I'm sure he had long-standing feelings of closeness, and he probably had some regret in having to let it go.
He lost roughly $1/3 billion as a result of that sale. It was probably one of the worst business decisions ever made. In the 5 years after he sold the company, he had made more than he received for it, which was something like $150 million. And this is one of the times you see the really tragic side of Hughes's life, because he's convinced he has to sell it. He sells it. The judgment, of course, is later overturned. He really didn't have to.
One person who gained from the sale was Bill Gay, who now became executive vice president.
One person who gained from the sale was Bill Gay, who now became executive vice president.
Was supposedly based on word from on high. It wasn't until after Hughes' death that we began to wonder if anybody ever did, if Hughes ever did make those pronouncements.
The new executive committee opted to consolidate the remaining Hughes Nevada holdings under an umbrella corporation.
The new company that is created for the remainder of his holdings is called Summa Corporation. And when he first sees the name, he doesn't even understand what it is.
If you stop and consider, all of the companies that Hughes owned prior to Summa were all Hughes. There was Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Helicopters, Hughes this, Hughes Oil Company, Hughes Tool Company, Hughes, whatever it was, had Hughes in the name. Summa suddenly became the first company that didn't have a Hughes name on it, Summa.
It's one of those really sad points when you realize here is his, the business that provided the basis for everything that he did is gone. In the surviving business, he doesn't even know what the name means.
In March of 1973, Hughes relocated once more, this time to the Inn on the Park Hotel in London. There, he briefly emerged from his self-imposed isolation to agree to a face-to-face meeting with Governor O'Callaghan.
We went up late at night, it was after midnight, to meet with him. And they brought him in. He walked in, and we shook hands, and we sat down, and I asked the questions that had to be asked to make sure that we had the right person. Here's a man who was alive. It was his money, and he wanted to do this with his money, and that's fine.
He had to find someplace where a now deteriorating individual, whose health was deteriorating, could in fact live easily. His last port of call, of course, was Mexico.
During this period, Hughes was informed that he had been moved to Acapulco under the guise of a lack of available drugs in Freeport. However, the reality was that drugs were being supplied by a pharmaceutical company based in New York.
He is no longer probably mentally in control, of his complete faculties. It would certainly appear that way when you're looking at the memos he's writing, and you're looking at all the drugs he's consuming.
I'm not so sure the new people that came on board thought about protecting him at all. They may have thought only about themselves and how they could enhance their own lives.
You also saw this by virtue of the fact that the people were, back in those days, trying to get him to, well, where's your will? You get the will all in shape. There was a lot of concern.
Hughes never gave anything of the company away. He never gave anything of the company away. So everybody was trying to get a secure position.
Some of those aides at that time were making $75,000 a year for delivering messages, taking telephone calls. That may not seem like a lot of money today, but if you go back in time, in that year, median family income, meaning the average family in the U.S. was earning $12,000. So if you were looking at that today, you would be paying these people to do these errand jobs almost $250,000.
I can go down that whole list. If I were in the headhunting business, I don't know where I'd start to find any one of them a $10,000 job.
The final days of Howard Hughes stood in stark contrast to the image of the man who once wielded such formidable control over his life. Hughes had become so weakened that he could no longer summon the strength to inject himself with codeine.
There was a story on the wire about a doctor in Mexico that had examined Hughes, and he was the first indication that I read, this is prior to many books that were published, that Hughes was definitely in very poor physical condition when he got to him.
He's got bed sores all over him. He's got a gaping sore on his head, bruises. And although the doctor doesn't see those, he's got broken hypodermic needles in his arm.
And it wasn't the kind of physical condition that had just developed during a week or so of illness. It was the kind of physical condition that apparently developed over many years of either a lifestyle or neglect.
The doctor's just looking at him physically and saying, why isn't this man in a hospital? And that's really a sad picture of a person who is deteriorated to that point, and no one really seems to care.
And it's not the Howard Hughes that I knew. It was helpless, really helpless.
Probably the most striking thing is this picture of a man who basically is all alone.
While there are the aides around him and people who have been around him for a long period of time, there isn't what you would call anybody really close to him.
I hate to think so, but I think he probably was very sad at the end. He had no more TWA, no more Spruce Goose, no more studio. He just had a lot of money.
On April 5th, 1976, Hughes slipped into a coma. His body lay still, except for tremors in the muscles of his face. Hughes' personal physician was summoned to the penthouse, but upon arrival, instead of promptly attending to the comatose Hughes, he spent nearly 2 hours rummaging through the files kept in the suite.
He began shredding documents that were in the hotel. And I have a feeling that there was a lot of this going on throughout the Hughes organization in those last days. A lot of documents were being destroyed. And the question always is, what were they and why?
4 hours later, Hughes was transported by air ambulance to Houston.
Had a beard, long, scraggly type hair, gray hair, and just a very shriveled up type of appearance, like he'd lost a lot of weight.
He looked almost dead when he boarded the airplane, because his eyes were wide open, and there was really very little life at all, if any, left in him. He was alive, though, because I did notice his mouth moved just a little bit once or twice.
As we were taxiing into the customs ramp, the doctor in the back said, just take your time, there's no need to hurry any longer. That's how we knew at that time. He died apparently as we were descending into Houston, just as we were coming in, approaching the airport.
The preliminary autopsy findings demonstrated that Mr. Hughes died of chronic renal disease.
One of the interesting things on that original autopsy was that the report said that he had a very minimal amount of codeine in his body, and it was an amount basically commensurate with anyone taking a therapeutic dose of codeine, a dose that's recommended. But what you see is that the volume he had in his body, that people in the past had died from such volumes. We did the story that he had a potentially lethal dose of codeine in his body, and up until that point that hadn't been reported.
Additionally, concealed in the original autopsy reports were X-rays revealing the remnants of hypodermic needles that had broken off in both of Hughes' arms.
I think you look at the man's physical condition when he arrives in Houston aboard the plane, and I think anybody has to ask the question, how does someone get in this condition?
Can you imagine a man with 7 broken hypodermic needles in his arm? A man who's responsible for having built the biggest medical foundation in the history of man? Having a sore that oozes, a bone that's sticking out of his shoulder?
This is not the picture of someone who is being really cared for. And the question is why?
I've often said that people have asked me, do you think they killed this man? And my answer is a very, I believe, fair one. If sheer negligence qualifies as a weapon, yes, they did.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them eastward. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.